Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a 1950s American kitchen before sunrise when the linoleum is cold beneath your feet, the floral curtains are still black against the windows, and the chrome percolator is preparing to make more noise than any respectable person should make before 6 in the morning. On the counter sits a loaf of sliced bread in waxed paper, beside it a ceramic butter dish, a wooden recipe box, and yesterday's folded newspaper waiting to become useful as a landing place for bacon grease. The room looks cheerful in daylight. At this hour it feels more like a small factory that has misplaced its workers and assigned the entire morning shift to one woman in slippers. The kitchen must be awake before the family wakes. Coffee must already smell like coffee breakfast, must be moving toward completion. Lunches must be assembled, and no one should encounter the unsettling possibility that food requires planning heat timing, or a human being willing to rise first. This is not simply a story about cooking. It is about the strange rules that turned an ordinary kitchen into a daily test of competence, thrift, cleanliness, affection, and personal character. Apparently civilization was depending on the eggs. Before we move any deeper into the darkness, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the forgotten routines, hidden pressures, and peculiar little rules of old America. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there, and let me know what kitchen rules survived in your family long after the 1950s had disappeared. Did someone insist that the sink be empty before bed, that bread never be wasted, or that nobody touch the good dish towels under any circumstances? Many of these stories begin with your memories and suggestions, so keep them coming. Now dim the lights, turn on a fan if you have one, pull the blanket a little higher, and let your shoulders loosen. The modern kitchen can manage without you for a while. Probably. Tonight we're going to ask what time a housewife was expected to begin her day, why breakfast had to appear before anyone requested it, how a spotless counter became evidence of moral stability, whether new appliances actually reduced labour, and what happened when the family schedule refused to cooperate. Could she admit that she was tired? Could she serve something simple without appearing careless? And how many domestic emergencies could one slice of burnt toast create before sunrise? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1955. You're standing in a modest kitchen in an American neighborhood where the houses are close enough for curtains to function as a primitive communication system. The clock above the refrigerator says 5:47. Your cotton house dress hangs on the bedroom door, but for the moment you're wearing a robe with a loose belt and trying not to step on the one floorboard that announces movement to the entire household. The refrigerator hums beside you with the solemn confidence of a machine that cost a significant portion of someone's yearly savings. Inside are glass milk bottles, a covered bowl of leftover potatoes, half a grapefruit eggs in a cardboard carton, and a small dish containing bacon drippings saved from the previous morning. The family expects breakfast shortly after 7. One child needs a lunch packed. Another has misplaced a school paper that will somehow become your emergency. Your husband must leave with enough time to reach work, and the coffee should be ready before he begins looking for it. No one has formally handed you a timetable. They have simply arranged their lives around the assumption that you already know it. Welcome to efficiency. The first rule of the morning is that the kitchen should appear prepared even when you are not. You strike a match beneath the gas burner, or turn the stiff control on an electric range depending on the age and prosperity of the house, then measure coffee into the percolator with the careful confidence of someone who has performed this action hundreds of times while not technically awake. Water goes into the lower chamber. The metal basket settles into place. The lid closes with a small click. Soon the pot begins its rhythmic bubbling, and the dark liquid jumps visibly beneath the glass knob on top. That sound is the kitchen clearing its throat. While the coffee works, you remove eggs, butter and milk from the refrigerator, set a skillet on the stove and unfold the paper grocery list that has been amended several times in pencil. The list contains more than food. It contains the week's available money, the children's preferences, the husband's expectations, the possibility of company, and your private calculation of how many different meals can be extracted from one roast without anyone accusing the roast of returning. A modern project manager might recognize the complexity. She would also request a salary. Breakfast cannot begin when the family enters the room. By then, breakfast must already be approaching its final form. Bacon should be crisp but not brittle eggs, cooked according to individual preference toast, warm enough to suggest attention, and coffee strong enough to restore adult conversation without becoming a subject of complaint. The table requires plates, cups, saucers, spoons, napkins, juice glasses, sugar, and perhaps a small pitcher of cream. None of these objects is individually difficult. Together they form a quiet obstacle course conducted while listening for footsteps upstairs. A child may suddenly announce that today requires a clean white shirt. Someone may discover that the lunch thermos still smells faintly of yesterday's soup. The bread may brown faster than expected because toasters in this period were perfectly capable of producing 2 pale slices, followed immediately by a small domestic fire. You scrape the darkest edge over the sink, butter the acceptable surface, and place the repaired slice beneath a folded napkin or on a warmed plate. The family will see toast. You will see a narrowly avoided decline in household morale. The strange thing is that much of this labor was described as routine precisely because it happened every day. Repetition made the work look smaller from the outside, although it made the responsibility larger for the person performing it. You had to remember who disliked soft eggs, which child would eat crusts, how much coffee remained in the tin, whether the milk would last until tomorrow, and which leftovers needed to be used before they became both wasteful and suspicious. The kitchen was filled with visible objects and invisible calculations. A polished stove suggested order. A clean sink implied discipline. A well-timed breakfast represented care. When something failed, the failure could feel oddly personal. Burned bacon was not simply burned bacon. It was evidence that the morning had escaped your control before the day had officially begun. Yet there was affection here too. Many women took real pride in feeding their families, preserving familiar recipes, stretching limited budgets, and creating warmth in a room that held much of the household's daily life. The problem was not that the work had no meaning. The problem was that meaningful work was expected to be constant, cheerful, and nearly invisible. By the time the first bedroom door opens upstairs, the coffee is ready, the skillet is hot, the table is set, and the kitchen looks as though morning happened naturally. It did not, and soon the breakfast clock will begin judging every minute. Breakfast was not simply a meal. It was an appointment, and every item on the table had its own unfortunate relationship with the clock. At 6:58, the eggs might still be soft, the coffee might be perfect, and the bacon might have achieved that narrow state between limp disappointment and structural engineering. At 7:03, the eggs would begin to tighten, the coffee would grow bitter on the burner, and the toast would surrender its last trace of warmth. The family, meanwhile, could arrive whenever it pleased. A husband might pause upstairs to find a missing collar stay. A child might remember a book report that needed a parent's signature. Someone might occupy the bathroom with the calm confidence of a person who had never watched breakfast cool in real time. You stood between the stove and the table, listening to the wall clock lifting lids, lowering flames, and trying to make several foods reach perfection at the exact moment several people finally decided to appear. This was less like serving breakfast, and more like coordinating trains at a station where none of the passengers had been informed that a timetable existed. Toast was the most fragile participant in this operation. Bread could wait patiently in its waxed paper wrapper, but once lowered into the toaster, it entered a brief and unforgiving career. Some electric toasters required you to turn the slices by hand. Others promised automatic pop-up convenience, although their interpretation of automatic occasionally included pale bread-scorched corners or a sudden metallic snap that caused everyone in the kitchen to reconsider the modern age. When the toast emerged, it had to be buttered while hot so the butter softened into the surface instead of sitting on top like a cold yellow roof tile. Then it needed to reach the table quickly, perhaps under a folded napkin inside a toast rack or on a warmed plate intended to delay the inevitable. Delay was all you could offer. Toast did not respect family discussions, lost homework, shaving complications, or children who suddenly disliked the jam they had requested the previous week. It cooled with complete impartiality. Yet breakfast advice in cookbooks and women's magazines often treated warm food as evidence of thoughtful household management. The bread had no moral character of its own, so naturally yours would have to carry the burden. The family begins arriving in stages. One child sits down and immediately reaches for a piece of toast before the others appear. You ask him to wait because breakfast is supposed to begin together. He waits for perhaps 12 seconds, then touches it again, as though checking whether it has become legally available. Your husband enters with one sleeve buttoned, unfolds the newspaper beside his plate, and lifts the coffee cup before fully sitting down. Another child appears without shoes. The carefully timed meal has now become a collection of individual negotiations. One person wants an egg cooked longer. Another believes the bacon is touching the grapefruit and therefore creating a crisis of flavour. Someone asks whether there is more toast, even though the first batch remains on the table cooling under its napkin. You return to the toaster where a second round begins. The first breakfast you prepared is still being eaten. The second breakfast is now under construction. This was one of the kitchen's quieter rules. Food should be ready when people wanted it, even if people wanted it at different times while continuing to describe the household as eating together. Timing mattered partly because the morning schedule extended beyond the table. The husband's train bus or drive to work could not be delayed by an egg. School began at a fixed hour and children required lunches, coats permissioned, slips, combed hair, and occasional reminders that shoes were not an optional educational accessory. A woman who worked outside the home faced an even sharper version of the same schedule, preparing food while also preparing herself for a job that would not accept domestic explanations for lateness. In homes with less money, breakfast might be simpler oatmeal toast eggs when affordable reheated biscuits, or whatever could stretch efficiently across several appetites. Rural households might begin earlier around farm work. Regional habits changed the plate, and family income changed its abundance, but the pressure of coordination remained widely familiar. Food had to fit the movements of the household. The household was rarely expected to fit the needs of the cook. By the time everyone was seated, you had already walked the route between refrigerator, stove sink, cupboard and table so many times that the kitchen floor could have issued you a transit pass. Then came the rule against visible frustration. A cold slice of toast could be reheated, replaced or quietly eaten by the person who made it. A cold mood was harder to disguise. The ideal breakfast table was cheerful but not noisy, orderly, but not severe, nourishing, but not extravagant and efficient without looking hurried. You were expected to notice empty cups, refill juice, pass the butter, remove a dropped spoon, answer a question about the day, and continue monitoring the skillet without appearing distracted. The public image of the homemaker often suggested that these attentions came naturally from affection. Affection was certainly present. So was concentration. There is a difference between wanting your family to begin the day well and being held personally responsible for every variable that might prevent it. The child's bad mood, the husband's late departure, the missing glove, the overcooked egg, and the stubborn toaster all gathered in the same room where one person was expected to absorb them and keep the atmosphere pleasant. The kitchen clock ticked above this arrangement, with the serenity of an object that had never packed a lunch. By 7:20 the meal is ending unevenly. A chair scrapes back. The newspaper folds. Someone drinks the last of the milk that had been intended for cooking later. Crumbs remain beneath the toast rack, a thin skin forms over the unfinished oatmeal, and one abandoned half-slice lies beside a smear of marmalade. The family moves toward the front door, carrying briefcases, school books, and the confidence that breakfast has concluded. For you, it has merely entered its second phase. Cups must be gathered, grease-handled leftovers, covered dishes washed or stacked, the table wiped and the floor inspected for evidence of a child's relationship with toast crumbs. The food was expected to arrive hot, but the work it created could remain for hours. Still, there was a small satisfaction when the timing succeeded, when everyone left fed, when no one missed the bus, and when the kitchen settled into a temporary quiet. The rule against cold toast was never really about bread. It was about anticipation, knowing what people would need before they asked, and arranging the morning so smoothly that they never had to wonder who made it possible. And beside the cooling toaster, the percolator was still bubbling, ready to explain which morning authority came next. Coffee was not merely a beverage. It was the morning's unofficial permission slip for adult speech. Before the first cup, questions were dangerous, opinions were premature, and cheerful conversation could be interpreted as a personal attack. The percolator understood this better than anyone. It sat on the stove or kitchen counter with a broad metal body, a curved black handle, and a small glass knob through which the household could watch civilization slowly return. Water, heated below, rose through the central tube and splashed over the coffee grounds in steady dark pulses. First came the faint metallic ticking, then the bubbling, then the smell moving beyond the kitchen into the hallway and upstairs bedrooms, announcing that the house had begun without requiring you to climb the stairs and say so. The sound became part of the architecture of morning, as familiar as the clock, and more persuasive than an alarm. You could judge the strength by colour timing habit and the private memory of yesterday's complaint. Too pale suggested carelessness. Too strong suggested waste or aggression. Coffee had to be firm enough to revive a husband facing traffic, a train platform, or an office supervisor, but not so powerful that it appeared to be preparing him for combat. A narrow diplomatic range. Naturally, you were responsible for finding it. The coffee itself might come from a vacuum-sealed tin with a bright printed label opened by a key that unwound a thin strip of metal around the top. The first release produced a rich roasted smell strong enough to suggest luxury, even in a kitchen where the grocery budget had been negotiated down to the last few coins. Some families bought familiar national brands. Others chose a less expensive store label, stretched the grounds farther than the package recommended, or mixed the final spoonfuls from one tin with the beginning of another. You measured with a metal scoop or an ordinary spoon, often by instinct rather than written instruction, because the household had already established what good coffee meant, and would notice immediately if you experimented. The grounds went into the perforated basket, the stem was fitted into the pot, and the lid settled over the whole arrangement like the roof of a small industrial plant. Once the water began to circulate, leaving the pot unattended for too long could produce a bitter brew that tasted as though the beans had been questioned by authorities. Removing it too early created something brown hot and technically defensible. The ideal cup required attention at precisely the time when bacon, eggs, lunches, missing shoes, and school papers were also requesting jurisdiction. At the breakfast table, coffee established an order that nobody had formally written down. Your husband's cup was usually filled first, particularly if he was expected to leave early. The handle faced the convenient direction. Cream and sugar were within reach even if he took neither, because a properly arranged table anticipated possibilities. You might pour your own cup and leave it near the stove where it would cool, while you replaced toast, wiped spilled juice, found a clean spoon, and reminded someone that the newspaper was not a wall between him and the rest of the family. Every few minutes you returned to the cup, took a small distracted sip, and discovered that coffee obeyed the same cruel law as toast. It remained hot only while you were too busy to drink it. Reheating was possible, but reheated coffee could acquire a tired edge, especially after sitting over heat, and the ideal homemaker was supposedly serving freshness rather than evidence. Yet many women drank exactly that evidence, half a cup taken in stages, warmed again, forgotten beside the sink, and finally swallowed after the front door closed. The family consumed coffee as a beginning. You consumed it as an interruption. Advertising treated coffee as more than a stimulant. It was presented as hospitality, romance, reassurance, and proof that a woman understood the emotional machinery of her home. Magazine images showed smiling couples over gleaming cups, gracious hostesses pouring for guests, and husbands visibly restored by the competent presence of a proper brew. Some advertisements suggested that disappointing coffee could threaten domestic approval with an intensity usually reserved for unpaid mortgages. A wife did not merely prepare a drink. She protected the atmosphere of breakfast, encouraged conversation, welcomed visitors, and confirmed that the household remained warm, generous, and efficiently supplied. The message was exaggerated, but it worked because it attached ordinary affection to a purchasable product. Making coffee for someone could indeed be an intimate gesture. You remembered how strong your husband preferred it, whether your mother added evaporated milk, which neighbor took one spoonful of sugar, and whether an elderly relative needed the cup diluted. The pressure entered when care became a test with only one correct result. A weak pot might be teased, a burned pot might be blamed. A perfect pot disappeared without comment, which was one of the kitchen's most reliable methods of performance evaluation. The percolator also served social life beyond breakfast. When a neighbour stepped through the back door when a relative arrived after church, or when the women's club gathered around a polished table, coffee created the acceptable reason to sit down. You brought out cups and saucers rather than everyday mugs if the occasion required it, arranged sugar in a bowl, offered cream from a small pitcher, and perhaps set down cookies, coffee cake, or something left from the previous afternoon. The ritual filled pauses and made conversation feel purposeful. Hands could lift cups while voices moved carefully through school news, family updates, recipes, illnesses, and the highly regulated territory of other people's behavior. Refusing coffee was allowed, but it required explanation. Serving none at all risked making a visit feel unfinished. In working-class homes, rural kitchens, black communities, immigrant households, and city apartments, the details varied, but hot drinks and shared food often carried the same practical meaning. You were welcome enough to be offered something, and the host was managing the room. Even when money was limited, hospitality was expected to look generous. A pot could be stretched with more water, cups could be smaller, and the final cookies could be cut in half. The appearance of abundance required arithmetic. By mid-morning, the kitchen has changed character. The family is gone, the breakfast dishes are drying, and sunlight finally reaches the countertop. The percolator rests near the stove, no longer commanding the room, but still holding enough coffee for another cup. You lift the lid and assess what remains. Throwing it away would be wasteful. Leaving it too long would make it unpleasant. Drinking it now would be sensible, but the laundry is waiting, the beds are unmade, and the refrigerator has begun to produce the faint reminder that something inside should be used soon. You pour anyway. This cup is yours, although ownership does not guarantee uninterrupted possession. The coffee is warmer than expected, strong, slightly bitter, and welcome. For a few minutes you stand beside the sink without serving anyone. That small pause matters. The kitchen ideal often portrayed coffee as something a woman gave to a husband, a visitor, a committee, a tired relative, but it could also provide one of the few quiet intervals she claimed for herself. The percolator had helped wake the household, regulate its mood, and smooth its departure. Now it offered a modest private reward before the next rule arrived in the form of a jar beside the stove filling slowly with bacon grease that no sensible kitchen was expected to waste. Saving bacon grease was not a quaint little habit. It was household accounting in liquid form. After breakfast, the skillet still held a shallow pool of fat darkened slightly by salt smoke and the browned edges of whatever had just been cooked. You did not carry it straight to the trash. That would have looked less like cleanliness and more like financial recklessness. Instead, you let it cool just enough to handle, then poured it through a small strainer into a tin glass jar or enamel container kept near the stove or inside the refrigerator. A few crumbs might be caught. A faint smoky smell remained. By noon, the grease would have settled into a pale, solid layer waiting to return in another meal, as though breakfast had opened a savings account. It might fry potatoes, season green beans, enrich cornbread, begin a pan of gravy, or lend flavour to beans that had never personally encountered a piece of meat. In a kitchen shaped by depression memories, wartime rationing, limited wages, and the ordinary fear of running short before payday throwing away useful fat could feel almost indecent. The rule was simple. If food still had one more job to perform, you were expected to find it. The same principle applied to meat drippings. A roast did not end when the slices left the platter. Beneath it remained a glossy mixture of fat, browned juices and dark particles stuck to the pan, all of which represented future flavour and therefore future responsibility. You tilted the roasting pan, carefully spooned off the fat, scraped the browned surface, and decided what could become gravy, what should be saved, and what might be used to moisten tomorrow's leftovers. The process required judgment. Too much fat made the gravy heavy. Too little made it thin and vaguely apologetic. Flour had to be stirred into the drippings without forming lumps, broth or water added gradually, and the whole mixture whisked or beaten until it looked smooth enough to suggest that nothing alarming had happened 5 minutes earlier. Gravy was one of those foods that appeared comforting only after surviving a tense negotiation. If it succeeded, the roast seemed richer and the meal more generous. If it failed, the family might still eat it, but they would know. A lumpy gravy boat had the social presence of an uninvited relative. No one wished to discuss it directly, yet everyone adjusted around it. Thrift in the 1950s kitchen was not simply a response to poverty, it was also a measure of character. Many women had grown up during the Great Depression, or learned housekeeping during the shortages and rationing of the Second World War. Habits of saving did not disappear merely because advertisements now displayed shining supermarkets and refrigerators full of abundance. A prosperous household might still fold waxed paper for reuse save string rinse jars, scrape every usable bit of shortening from a can, and keep a bowl of drippings beneath a loose cover. The post-war consumer economy encouraged buying, but household morality continued to praise careful management. A good homemaker was expected to stretch without seeming strained, conserve without appearing poor, and provide generously without revealing the arithmetic underneath. The roast on Sunday might become sandwiches on Monday, hash on Tuesday, and soup stock by Wednesday, each version entering the dining room with a different name and sufficient confidence. Repetition was acceptable, recognition was not. Leftovers needed discretion, and grease needed purpose. This economy of saving created its own small geography around the stove. One container held bacon fat, another might hold drippings from beef or poultry. A jar with a screw top waited for used cooking oil. Paper bags, glass jars, tins, and scraps of wrapping material occupied drawers with the quiet authority of objects that might become useful later. Not every household saved the same things, and not every method was safe or sanitary by modern standards. Practices varied by region, income, family tradition, refrigeration, and the knowledge passed from one generation to another. In some kitchens, grease remained beside the stove for repeated use. In others, it was refrigerated and labelled, or at least placed in a container whose identity everyone understood without needing a label. Confusing bacon fat with something sweet was unlikely, though perhaps only once. The homemaker's task was to remember what each jar contained when it had been collected, and whether it had crossed the delicate boundary between economical and questionable. Nothing announced that boundary. The nose-that-eye experience and a willingness to reconsider dinner carried most of the burden. The emotional weight of thrift appeared most clearly when something had to be discarded. A scorched pan, spoiled milk, mouldy bread, or forgotten dish in the refrigerator could produce more than irritation. Waste suggested poor planning. Poor planning suggested weak management. Weak management could feel like a personal failure, especially when the household budget left little room for mistakes. You might trim the stale edge from bread, cut a bruised section from fruit, turn sour milk into a recipe that could safely use it, or combine small portions of vegetables into soup. Such ingenuity was real skill, not merely deprivation. Women developed deep knowledge of texture, smell, timing, substitution, and the behavior of ingredients under pressure. They knew how to make a meal appear complete when the cupboard was not. They understood which flavor could disguise another ingredient's second appearance, and which dish would absorb the last spoonful of saved fat. Yet the praise for thrift often ignored the mental work required to practice it. Saving money was treated as a natural feminine instinct, as though jars organized themselves and forgotten potatoes issued polite reminders. There was also a social difference between being thrifty and looking thrifty. A woman could be admired for stretching the budget, but she was not necessarily encouraged to reveal how urgently the budget needed stretching. Guests should not feel that the cake had been made with the last egg that the beans depended on saved grease, or that the roast had been planned to survive 3 separate dinners. The meal needed to communicate stability. In middle-class homes, thrift was often dressed as cleverness or efficiency. In poorer households, the same practice could be necessity with less decorative language. Black families confronting discriminatory wages and restricted access to housing and credit, rural families far from large markets, immigrant households preserving older food traditions, and working-class women balancing paid work with cooking all developed strategies that did not fit neatly inside the polished suburban advertisements. The magazine kitchen presented conservation as a cheerful trick. Real kitchens knew it as memory, skill, caution, pride, and sometimes exhaustion. The saved bacon grease on the shelf could represent flavour. It could also represent the knowledge that next week's money had already begun to disappear. By late afternoon, that morning's grease may return to the stove. A spoonful melts in a skillet, becoming clear and fragrant as sliced potatoes begin to sizzle. The same fat that seemed like residue at breakfast now helps build dinner, carrying smoke and salt into a new dish. Nothing dramatic has happened. No guest will ask for the history of the potatoes. The family may never know that part of the meal was rescued hours earlier from a pan they had already forgotten. That was the strange dignity of kitchen economy. Its success erased the evidence of effort. The food tasted fuller, the budget stretched farther, and the household moved through another day without noticing the chain of decisions that made it possible. You wipe the spoon, close the grease container, and return it to its place. There is still enough left for tomorrow. Nearby, your house dress bears a faint spot from the skillet, and the back door may open at any moment. Saving everything was one rule. Looking presentable while doing it was about to become another. Clothing in the kitchen was not merely clothing. It was protective equipment, social camouflage, and a warning system for unexpected visitors. By mid-morning, you would change from a robe into a cotton house dress, something washable, practical and respectable enough for the work ahead. The fabric might be printed with small flowers checks or cheerful geometric shapes, because domestic labour apparently became less tiring when surrounded by decorative optimism. The dress buttoned down the front or fastened at the side, allowing you to put it on without disturbing pin curls or carefully arranged hair. Over it went an apron tied firmly at the waist, its pockets already collecting a clothespin, a grocery note, a handkerchief, and one small object whose purpose you would forget until laundry day. The apron protected the dress from grease-flour dishwater and the unpredictable enthusiasm of a boiling saucepan. More importantly, it created layers. The apron could absorb the evidence of labour while the dress beneath remained theoretically available for public inspection. You were dressed to work, but not to look as though work had defeated you. The apron itself could carry surprisingly complicated expectations. A plain bib apron was suitable for serious cooking, offering coverage from chest to knee. A smaller waist apron might appear later once the dangerous work was finished, and the kitchen had entered its more presentable phase. Pattern companies and women's magazines offered designs with ruffles, contrasting pockets, shaped waistbands, and decorative trim, transforming a shield against bacon grease into something that could be judged for neatness and taste. Some women sewed their own from inexpensive cotton or leftover fabric, using every usable scrap with the same thrift applied to food. Others received aprons as gifts from relatives who believed the kitchen required additional uniforms. There were aprons for ordinary meals, aprons for company aprons for holiday cooking, and aprons too decorative to expose to actual gravy. The last category fulfilled an important domestic tradition, owning an object for a task while protecting it from the task. Still, the everyday apron worked hard. It dried hands, lifted warm pan handles when no potholder was nearby, carried vegetables from the garden, wiped a child's face in an emergency, and occasionally became the nearest available surface for removing flour from your fingers. By noon, it was less a garment than a written record of everything the kitchen had attempted. The house dress beneath it was supposed to remain neat enough for the possibility that someone might see you. This possibility shaped the entire day. The milkman might come to the side door. A neighbour might arrive to borrow sugar while clearly intending to collect information. A salesman might ring the bell with a case full of brushes, cosmetics, cleaning products, or household miracles. A delivery driver might need a signature. The minister's wife, a committee member, or a relative passing through the neighbourhood could appear without warning. In a period before text messages, a visitor did not announce that she was 5 minutes away. She simply materialized on the porch while you were holding a raw chicken and wearing an apron that had recently lost an argument with tomato sauce. The doorbell therefore operated like a small electric alarm announcing that your private working condition might become public evidence. You stopped, looked down, wiped your hands, removed the stained apron, smoothed the dress, checked your hair in any reflective surface available, and moved toward the door while attempting to slow your breathing. The transformation had to occur before the visitor rang a second time. A second ring suggested impatience. It also suggested that you were failing to appear effortlessly available. The emergency transformation rarely required true elegance. It required plausibility. You did not need to look ready for a department store luncheon. You needed to look as though you had been calmly maintaining the home rather than wrestling with it. The dirtier apron came off and might be folded inward to hide the evidence before being placed over a chair or behind the pantry door. A cleaner apron could replace it if the visitor was likely to enter the kitchen. Lipstick might be applied quickly, not because a salesman deserved romance, but because colour on the face helped create the impression that the day was under control. Hair was pressed into place. Flour on the cheek was discovered too late. You opened the door with a smile that suggested you had not just crossed the house at military speed. Behind you, a saucepan might continue to simmer, the sink might contain breakfast dishes, and the radio might be broadcasting a soap opera whose volume suddenly seemed morally questionable. The visitor saw a tidy dress and a composed woman. The kitchen saw a deserter who would be punished upon return. This performance varied by class, region, age, community, and personal temperament. Women who worked outside the home could not spend the day dressed according to magazine ideals, and many changed clothes rapidly before or after paid employment. Farm women, factory workers, domestic workers, and women managing large families required clothing that survived physical strain rather than simply appearing cheerful in advertisements. Black women employed in white households might spend the day cooking, cleaning, and caring for another family in a uniform before returning home to perform similar work without wages. Working-class women often reused garments until fabric seams and patches told a more honest story than fashion columns did. Some homemakers genuinely enjoyed sewing attractive house dresses or felt more energetic when properly dressed. Others wore whatever was comfortable and hoped the neighbourhood survived the shock. The ideal was influential, but it was not universal. What mattered was the recurring message that a woman's appearance reflected the condition of the home. Wrinkled clothing suggested disorder. A stained dress suggested carelessness. Looking tired threatened to reveal that domestic work was tiring, which would have complicated the advertising. The rule became sharper as late afternoon approached. Morning work clothes might be accepted while children were at school and errands were underway, but many domestic guides and popular images encouraged women to freshen themselves before the husband returned. The house dress that had survived frying, scrubbing, lifting, bending, and repeated contact with dishwater had completed its public service. You washed your face, repaired your hair, changed into a cleaner dress, and perhaps added lipstick or powder. The apron might remain, but it should be clean and attractive, preferably one that implied cooking, without displaying the recent violence of cooking. This ritual was sometimes affectionate. A woman might enjoy feeling refreshed before dinner, just as anyone might prefer to change after a day of work. The pressure came from the unevenness of the expectation. His workday allowed him to return tired. Yours was supposed to disappear into a clean dress. He could carry the office home in his expression. You were encouraged to remove the kitchen from yours. There was practical intelligence in changing clothes. Grease and food odours travelled easily. Cotton dresses could be washed frequently. Aprons extended their life, and keeping a better garment away from cleaning products made financial sense. Yet practicality merged with performance until the two became difficult to separate. The apron protected the dress protected respectability, and respectability protected the household's public image. Each layer concealed the work beneath it. A visitor might admire how neat you looked, without noticing the damp hem, the small burn on one finger, or the fact that your stockings had been repaired more than once. The compliment could feel pleasant. It could also confirm that success depended on hiding the effort required to earn it. The ideal homemaker did not merely finish tasks. She removed the evidence that tasks had taken anything from her. When the door finally closes and the visitor leaves, you return to the kitchen. The abandoned saucepan has thickened. The dish towel has slipped to the floor. The clean apron must come off before it becomes the dirty apron, and the stained one waits where you hid it, patient and mildly accusing. You retie it around your waist and resume the work at the exact point where the doorbell interrupted it. For the visitor, the encounter lasted 4 pleasant minutes. For you, it created another pain to watch, another surface to wipe, and a fresh awareness that someone could appear at any time. The dress has done its duty. The apron has returned to service. Across the room, the sink is filling with dishes, and unlike unexpected guests, it has no intention of leaving politely. The sink was not simply where dishes went. It was the kitchen's confession booth, and every cup, saucepan, eggshell, greasy plate, and damp dishcloth arrived, carrying evidence of what had happened that day. A clear sink suggested discipline. A crowded sink suggested delay. Poor planning, illness, laziness. Too many children, an unexpected visitor, or some other private explanation that the kitchen was not interested in keeping private. By 8 in the morning, breakfast had already left behind cups stained with coffee plates marked by egg yolk, a skillet filled with bacon grease juice glasses, spoons, a sticky jam knife, and the percolator's metal basket full of wet grounds. The family had departed into the world with clean collars and full stomachs. You remained with the archaeological record. Hot water ran into the basin if the household plumbing and water heater were cooperating, and soap formed a thin layer of bubbles that smelled sharply clean. You scraped plates, emptied cups, stacked glassware away from heavy pans, and tried to create order before the next meal began producing its own evidence. A sink could fill faster than anyone admitted. It could also become the one visible corner of the kitchen that seemed capable of accusing you personally. Dishwashing followed an order that was practical enough to feel almost ceremonial. Glasses and cups usually went first while the water remained clean. Then came plates, bowls, and silverware. Greasy pans waited until the end where they could ruin the water without harming anything more delicate. Knives required attention because reaching blindly into cloudy dishwater was an excellent way to transform routine housework into a small medical event. Food scraps were scraped into the garbage pail, wrapped in newspaper or directed toward a disposal if the kitchen had one of the newer units and the family trusted it not to swallow a spoon. A rubber sink stopper, wire drainer, enamel, dishpan, bottle brush, soap flake, scouring powder, steel wool, and several cloths might crowd the surrounding counter. Each object had a purpose. Each object also required cleaning after helping you clean something else. The dishcloth had to be rinsed and hung where it could dry rather than develop a smell capable of announcing itself from across the room. The sink strainer needed emptying. The drain board had to be wiped. The faucet could be polished because water spots apparently represented a breakdown in civic order. By the time the dishes were finished, the equipment used to wash them had created a second, smaller washing assignment. For many households, an automatic dishwasher remained an aspiration rather than an ordinary companion. Advertisements displayed gleaming machines loaded by women who appeared to regard dirty plates as amusing little souvenirs. In kitchens without one, the work depended on hands, hot water, and repetition. Even where a dishwasher existed, pots, knives, delicate glassware, wooden utensils, and items that did not fit properly could still return to the sink. The machine promised freedom, but appliances had a habit of negotiating the terms after purchase. They needed detergent loading skill, maintenance space, and enough dishes to justify running them. A woman might be told that modern technology had liberated her while she stood beside a new machine rinsing every plate before placing it inside. This was progress, although it occasionally required performing the task twice so that the appliance could receive credit. In smaller homes, rented apartments, rural kitchens, and working-class households, the sink remained the central washing station. The advertisements showed the future. The dishpan knew the present. The deeper rule was not merely that dishes should be washed. They should disappear. A drying rack full of plates might be tolerated for a while, but leaving breakfast dishes visible into the afternoon could make the whole kitchen feel unfinished. If a neighbour entered through the back door, the sink was often one of the first things she saw. A clean basin suggested that you were ahead of the day. A stack of pans suggested the day was ahead of you. The judgment might never be spoken. Indeed, the most durable judgments rarely needed speech. One glance at the counter, one slight pause near the dish towel, and the information had been collected. Women could be generous with one another, helping with dishes after church suppers, family dinners, childbirth, illness, or grief. They also lived within communities where domestic competence affected reputation. The state of a kitchen might be interpreted as evidence of a woman's energy, health, marriage, finances, or character. Whether or not it proved any of those things, a man could leave papers across a desk and appear busy. A woman could leave dishes near a sink and appear overwhelmed. The plates were identical. The interpretation was not. Keeping the sink clear required constant calculation because the kitchen never stopped producing dishes long enough to be declared finished. After breakfast came baking lunch, preparation vegetables to wash meat to trim, and a mixing bowl used for something that would not be eaten until evening. You learned to wash as you worked, not because this made the task disappear, but because it prevented the final pile from achieving architectural significance. A saucepan simmered while you rinsed a measuring cup. A spoon was washed and used again. Flour was wiped before moisture turned it into paste. The cutting board was scrubbed after raw meat and set aside to dry. Advice about sanitation, cross-contamination, and food storage varied across the period and was not always expressed in modern terms, yet experienced cooks understood that spoiled food, dirty utensils, insects, and lingering grease created real problems. Cleanliness was practical. The pressure came when practical cleanliness expanded into visual perfection, as though a room in constant use should never look used. The sink was expected to serve the household while maintaining the expression of an employee who had not been inconvenienced. Some women developed a rhythm that made the work nearly meditative. Warm water eased stiff hands. Plates moved from wash basin to rinse water to rack in a familiar sequence. A radio program murmured from the counter. Sunlight shifted across the window above the sink. Through that window you might watch children walking home laundry, moving on neighbouring lines, or a delivery truck stopping 2 houses away. The sink could be a place of confinement, but it could also offer privacy inside activity. No one questioned a woman who stood washing dishes. She could think without appearing idle. She could replay an argument, plan the grocery budget, worry about a child, imagine a different life, or simply listen to the sound of water while her hands continued automatically. In larger and wealthier homes, paid domestic workers might perform this labour often. Women whose own household dishes waited after a day spent cleaning someone else's kitchen. Black women and immigrant women were heavily represented in domestic service in many communities, although their experiences varied widely by region and employer. The polished sink in one household could depend on another woman returning home tired to face her own. The work also left marks. Hot water reddened the skin. Soap and scouring powders dried the hands. A chipped glass could cut a finger. Heavy iron cookware strained the wrist. Reaching, lifting, scrubbing, and standing accumulated quietly, especially when repeated after every meal. Rubber gloves offered protection if you owned them, and remembered to use them, though they could fill with water at the cuff and create their own minor betrayal. Hand lotion might sit near the sink or beside the bed, another product promising to repair what domestic efficiency had removed. Advertisements often showed beautiful hands presenting clean dishes, polished glasses and spotless cookware. They rarely lingered on split cuticles or the small burn being kept dry beneath a bandage. The sink demonstrated one of the household's central contradictions. The cleaner the kitchen appeared, the less visible the physical cost of cleaning it. By early afternoon, the basin is finally empty. You rinse the last traces of soap, run a cloth around the porcelain or enamel, and polish the faucet with a dry towel. The dish rack has been cleared. Plates stand inside the cupboard. Pans hang or nest together. The damp cloth is spread neatly to dry and the room seems to exhale. For a few minutes the kitchen offers no visible proof of breakfast baking or lunch. It looks controlled because you have removed every sign of the work required to control it. This is satisfying. It is also temporary. Dinner will arrive with knives, bowls, skillets serving dishes and another round of cups. The sink has not been defeated. It has merely agreed to a brief ceasefire. Beside it, the refrigerator hums behind a closed door, preserving its own collection of covered bowls, milk bottles, vegetables, leftovers, and rules about where everything is permitted to live. The refrigerator was not simply a cold cupboard. It was a small domestic map, and every shelf carried its own border hierarchy and potential dispute. Open the heavy door in a 1950s kitchen, and a pale interior light reveals milk bottles, butter wrapped in paper eggs in a cardboard carton, a covered bowl of potatoes, half an onion, a jar of pickles, a plate of sliced meat beneath waxed paper, and several containers whose identities are known only to the woman who placed them there. The air smells faintly of cold metal dairy and yesterday's supper. Moisture beads along the back wall. A small freezer compartment occupies the upper corner, gathering frost with the determination of a glacier that has recently discovered property ownership. Nothing can be placed anywhere merely because there is room. Milk needs a dependable position. Butter belongs in its compartment. Leftovers must remain visible enough to be remembered, but concealed enough not to make the refrigerator look untidy. Raw meat must be kept away from foods ready to serve, even if the language of food safety is less standardized than it will become later. The refrigerator preserves food, but only after someone develops a private geography, detailed enough to prevent supper from becoming an archaeological expedition. Storage begins with containers, and containers begin with judgment. A plate can be covered with waxed paper aluminum foil, another inverted plate or a fitted cover if one happens to exist. Glass refrigerator dishes with lids offer a more orderly solution, their contents visible through clear sides and their rectangular shapes stacking neatly. Bowls without lids require improvisation. You stretch waxed paper across the rim and secure it as best you can, knowing that one careless movement may send the paper folding inward toward the gravy. Newer plastic storage products promise airtight freshness and impressive modern efficiency, though their lids may require a firm press and a degree of faith. Tupperware parties turn storage into a social demonstration showing women how to burp a container by lifting a corner while pressing the lid, releasing trapped air with a small sigh. It is a satisfying technique, partly because the container appears to obey. Yet acquiring the container does not decide what belongs inside it, how long the food should remain there, or whether anyone will eat it before its original identity becomes a matter of speculation. The modern lid solves one problem. It does not accept responsibility for Wednesday's beans. Every item needs to be placed according to how quickly it will spoil, how often it will be used, and how severely it might leak. Milk bottles are heavy and should stand where they will not tip when a child reaches for something behind them. Eggs remain in their carton or move to a moulded tray built into the door, an attractive feature that makes the refrigerator look organized, while also encouraging everyone to handle the door gently. Butter rests in a covered compartment, protected from stronger smells and from family members who believe closing a wrapper is optional. Vegetables collect in a crisper drawer, sometimes wrapped, sometimes loose depending on habit and advice. Cheeses covered carefully. Cooked meats are placed on a plate or in a dish, preferably where they can be seen before they dry out or become forgotten. A bowl of gelatin salad may occupy a surprising amount of space, while contributing very little structural flexibility. It cannot be tilted, compressed or reasoned with. It simply sits there bright and trembling, forcing the milk to relocate. Refrigerator organization was often presented as a neat system. In practice, it resembled diplomacy among foods with incompatible shapes. The coldest and most demanding territory was the freezer compartment. In many refrigerators of the period, it was a small metal box behind its own inner door, suitable for ice trays, a modest quantity of frozen food, and an increasingly ambitious wall of frost. Ice trays had metal dividers and levers designed to release cubes through mechanical persuasion. If the tray had frozen too firmly, the lever could resist, the cubes could crack unevenly, and your fingers could become attached briefly to the entire arrangement. Frozen vegetables, juice concentrate, or a package of meat might be wedged beside the trays, assuming frost had not consumed the available space. Eventually, the refrigerator required defrosting. Food was removed and placed in coolers, bowls, or whatever cold location could be trusted temporarily. The appliance was switched off or opened, and pans or towels were positioned to catch melting water. Some women hurried the process with warm water, while others waited and chipped carefully at the ice, a method that could damage the unit if enthusiasm exceeded caution. The refrigerator had been advertised as a labor-saving miracle. Periodically, it turned into a weather event inside the kitchen. The most difficult rule was that food should remain visible without making abundance look disorderly. Push a covered dish too far toward the back, and it might disappear behind the milk until its rediscovery became unpleasant. Leave everything near the front, and the refrigerator looked crowded, particularly when guests or neighbors were present. A well-managed interior communicated planning. Similar containers, wiped shelves, fresh vegetables, and clearly arranged food suggested that the household ate well and wasted little. Spills uncovered onions, hardened leftovers, and mystery jars suggested that the system had weakened. No official inspector was coming. The anxiety worked perfectly well without one. You wiped milk rings from shelves, checked whether meat juices had escaped rearranged jars by height, and moved a bowl 3 inches, simply because the refrigerator looked calmer afterward. Advertisements often displayed interiors packed with immaculate foods, every item bright, wholesome, and apparently free from packaging damage. Real refrigerators contained a heel of bread, half a lemon drying at the edge, and 1 jar nobody remembered buying. Refrigerator management also meant deciding what could safely be trusted, and what had reached the end of its service. Without printed expiration dates on every package or a modern search engine, waiting to advise you, the decision relied heavily on smell appearance, texture, habit, and experience. You examined the milk before pouring it, pressed a vegetable to test its firmness, lifted a cover and paused. Leftovers had to be judged not only for safety but for usefulness. Could the potatoes become patties? Could the roast be sliced for sandwiches? Could the cooked carrots survive another appearance if placed beneath a sauce, persuasive enough to distract the family? Waste carried moral and financial weight, yet illness carried consequences of its own. The line between prudent thrift and excessive optimism could be thin. Experienced homemakers learned that line through instruction, family knowledge, mistakes, and repetition. They also learned to remove spoiled food discreetly. Throwing something away was regrettable. Serving it and discovering the decision publicly was worse. Not every household possessed the spacious, gleaming refrigerator shown in national advertising. Some families used older models with small interiors and unreliable seals. Some rural homes had only recently gained dependable electricity. Apartments might contain narrow units with limited freezer space, while poorer households managed with ice boxes or second-hand appliances longer than the magazine suggested. Families with several children could fill a refrigerator quickly, especially when milk, leftovers, lunch ingredients, and large pots competed for space. Black families facing housing discrimination and unequal access to credit could encounter fewer appliance choices even when income permitted a purchase. Working women managed refrigerator planning around jobs, transportation, and evening fatigue rather than the leisurely meal schedules imagined in domestic illustrations. The rule of correct placement remained useful, but the polished system was easier to maintain when money time. Square footage and reliable electricity cooperated. Domestic order was often praised as personal talent, even when it depended heavily on material advantage. By evening, the refrigerator has been opened and closed dozens of times. A child has returned the milk to the wrong shelf. Someone has pushed the butter dish backward without replacing its cover. The leftover potatoes now sit beside a new bowl of prepared vegetables, and dinner ingredients have taken over the front row. You move the milk close, the butter wipe one small spill, and check the meat for tomorrow. The interior light throws a pale rectangle across your dress while cold air gathers around your knees. For a moment you stand there taking inventory. The refrigerator holds more than food. It holds unfinished meals, future decisions, money already spent, and the evidence of whether you have successfully predicted the family's appetite. You close the door firmly and hear the seal catch. Everything is contained again, but the covered dishes inside are only waiting for their next assignment. Because in a properly managed kitchen, leftovers were not supposed to return looking like leftovers. Leftovers were not supposed to return to the table looking as though they remembered yesterday. A slice of roast beef could not simply reappear beside the same potatoes under the same gravy and expect the family to applaud its persistence. It needed a new shape, a new source, or at least a sufficiently confident name. Yesterday's meat became hash croquettes, sandwiches, shepherd's pie, or a mixture folded beneath mashed potatoes and baked until the top browned attractively. Cooked vegetables entered soups, casseroles, patties, or gelatin salads, where recognition became considerably more difficult for everyone involved. Stale bread could become crumbs, stuffing bread pudding, French toast, or a thickener for dishes that preferred not to discuss their ingredients openly. The transformation required more than reheating. You had to examine what remained, calculate how much could be stretched, choose a recipe that matched the cupboard, and produce something that felt intentional rather than rescued. The refrigerator had preserved the food. Your job was to preserve its dignity. The work often began after dinner when the family left the table, and you stood over the serving dishes deciding the future of every spoonful. A small portion of peas might not seem worth saving until you remembered that throwing food away was also a judgment on the grocery budget. 2 slices of meat could become tomorrow's lunch. Half a cup of gravy might revive potatoes. A few cooked carrots could join soup, assuming the soup was prepared to accept them without complaint. You transferred each portion into a covered bowl, wrapped plates in wax paper or foil, and placed them inside the refrigerator with a private plan attached. Nothing was labelled in most kitchens. The plan existed in your memory beside school schedules, laundry instructions, grocery needs, birthdays, and the fact that the good tablecloth still had a spot near one corner. Forgetting a leftover meant wasting food. Forgetting where you'd placed it meant discovering it later in a condition that no recipe could politely correct. The following day, transformation became a form of kitchen theatre. Cold roast was chopped finely with onion and potatoes, then pressed into a hot skillet until its edges turned crisp. The pieces lost their separate histories and became hash a dish respectable enough to appear on the table without apology. Mashed potatoes could be shaped into cakes dusted with flour and browned in fat until yesterday's softness developed a new and persuasive crust. Chicken was removed from the bone and folded into a creamy sauce tucked beneath biscuit dough or mixed with celery and mayonnaise for sandwiches. Even gravy could be stretched with broth milk or seasoning until it returned with renewed authority. The family might recognize the original ingredient, but successful reuse depended on preventing the meal from feeling repetitive. Variety was part of domestic competence, even when the ingredients had been attending the household for several days. The same food could return repeatedly. It merely needed different paperwork. Women's magazines, cookbooks, home economics lessons, and newspaper food pages frequently treated leftovers as opportunities for ingenuity. The language could be cheerful, planned overs, second-day dishes, economical meals, clever ways to avoid waste. The optimism made thrift sound creative rather than anxious, which it often was. Planning leftovers in advance could genuinely reduce expense and labour. A larger roast on Sunday might provide sandwiches, hash and soup during the week. A pot of beans could become several meals with different seasonings. Cooking once and adapting later was sensible management. Yet the advice also increased the expectation that a capable homemaker should solve scarcity without allowing anyone to feel deprived. She should stretch meat while making the plate appear generous, reuse vegetables without inviting complaints, and serve economy without letting it look economical. The family was permitted to become bored. The cook was expected to become inventive. This arrangement was described as resourcefulness because daily culinary disguise operation would have sounded less restful. The risk was that the disguise might fail. Children possessed a remarkable ability to identify yesterday's carrots beneath sauce cheese breadcrumbs or an architectural quantity of mashed potato. A husband might look at a casserole and ask whether it contained the roast from Sunday, using the tone of a man who had discovered financial irregularities. You could answer, lightly emphasize the new seasoning, and remind everyone that it was a different dish. Technically, this was true. Emotionally, the roast remained in the room. Some families welcomed familiar foods and disliked waste. Others treated repeated ingredients as evidence that the menu had lost ambition. A woman managing a tight budget had to understand not only food, but appetite, personality, and presentation. A neat garnish, a browned topping, a fresh side dish, or a different serving bowl could separate a clever meal from a public reminder that payday was still 3 days away. The food had already been cooked once. The social challenge had only begun. Leftover rules varied widely because American kitchens varied widely. In farm households, garden-produced preserved food, and large family meals created different patterns of reuse from those in small city apartments. Working-class families often stretched ingredients because the budget demanded it, while affluent households might frame the same behavior as efficient planning. Black cooks carried traditions of making full use of ingredients within communities shaped by unequal wages, segregation, and restricted access to stores and housing. Immigrant families adapted older recipes that had long treated bones, stale bread, cooked grains, and small portions of meat as valuable foundations rather than embarrassing remains. Women employed outside the home needed leftover meals that could be assembled quickly after work, though popular domestic imagery often pretended every dinner began with a calm afternoon of preparation. The suburban ideal claimed that creative reuse was a pleasant expression of feminine cleverness. For many women, it was the practical mathematics of feeding people when money, time, and energy were all limited. The pressure could become emotional because food carried messages beyond hunger. Serving a familiar dish might express continuity, memory, and care. Reusing everything could honour parents who had survived lean years. A pot of soup made from bones and vegetable scraps might fill the house with the smell that connected one generation to another. There was pride in wasting little and knowing how to coax flavour from modest ingredients. At the same time, constant transformation required attention that remained largely invisible. No one saw you calculate whether the chicken would stretch, whether the gravy would keep, or whether the children would accept another meal built from Sunday. They saw the finished casserole. If it worked, it disappeared. If it failed, it became conversation. The homemaker's reward for successful planning was often the absence of complaint, a standard of praise so subtle that it could easily be mistaken for silence. By dinner, yesterday's roast has become a skillet of crisp hash beneath a layer of onions. The potatoes have browned. A little gravy has been loosened and poured over the top. Fresh cabbage or canned green beans stand beside it, adding enough novelty to reassure the table that time is moving forward. The family eats. Someone asks for seconds. No one comments on the transformation, which means it has succeeded. You look toward the serving dish and calculate what will remain after this meal. Perhaps there will be just enough hash for one lunch, or perhaps the chain of reincarnation will finally end tonight. The rule against waste has been satisfied, the budget has been protected, and the roast has survived longer than some household appliances. Tomorrow a new meal will begin from fresh ingredients. At least that is the plan. On the counter, the recipe box waits with its cards arranged alphabetically, ready to explain why improvisation was admired only after it produced something worth writing down. A recipe card was not merely a set of instructions. It was a small rectangular promise that dinner could be controlled if every spoonful behaved. Inside the wooden box near the flour tin card stood upright beneath handwritten dividers for breads, meats, vegetables, desserts, preserves, and several mysterious categories created by relatives who did not believe in alphabetical order. Some cards were copied neatly from cookbooks or magazine pages. Others carried a mother's slanted handwriting, a neighbour's hurried substitutions, or a church friend's assurance that the cake never fails, a phrase that transferred all future responsibility directly to you. The best cards showed signs of use, softened corners, grease marks, flour along the edges, and a brown splash across one instruction that now required interpretation. You placed the card against a sugar bowl, or tucked it beneath the lid of the flour canister, hoping steam would not curl it into illegibility. On the counter waited metal measuring cups, nested spoons, a flour sifter, an enamel mixing bowl, and ingredients that had not read the instructions. The card promised order. The kitchen reserved the right to negotiate. Standard measurements were part of the modern, efficient kitchen ideal. Home economics classes, cookbooks packaged, food instructions and company recipe booklets encouraged women to level flour measure liquids at eye height, distinguish teaspoons from tablespoons, and stop treating a little as a recognized scientific unit. A dry measuring cup was filled and levelled with the back of a knife. Brown sugar might be packed firmly enough to hold the shape of the cup when turned out. Shortening was pressed into a measure to eliminate air pockets or displaced water in a glass cup if the recipe required more creativity than dignity. Liquid went into a marked glass measure placed on a level surface, because holding it in the air while guessing was apparently how civilization lost cakes. These instructions were useful. Baking depended on proportion, and standardized measures made recipes easier to repeat across kitchens. Yet exactness also created a new kind of anxiety. If biscuits emerged heavy or a cake sank in the middle, you could not blame vague ancestral wisdom. The quarter teaspoon had provided evidence. The card rarely told the whole story. It might say to cream butter and sugar until light without explaining how long this should take in a cold kitchen, with stiff butter and an electric mixer that grew warm enough to concern you. It might instruct you to add flour alternately with milk, assuming you knew which ingredient should begin, which should end, and how much enthusiasm counted as overmixing. Bake until done required a private definition of done based on smell, color, touch, oven behavior, and experience. Some recipes gave a temperature, but household ovens did not always interpret numbers with equal sincerity. A gas flame might heat unevenly. An older range might have hot corners. An oven thermometer could offer a second opinion, though agreement between the dial and thermometer was not guaranteed. You learned to rotate pans, shield an edge with foil, move a rack, or open the door at precisely the wrong moment and watch a cake collapse as though personally offended by fresh air. The recipe was written in ink. The real instructions lived in your hands. Improvisation was admired when it worked and treated as carelessness when it did not. An experienced cook might replace sour cream with evaporated milk, adjusted with lemon juice, use drippings instead of shortening stretch, a sauce reduce sugar, or add an ingredient because the batter looked wrong. She knew the texture of biscuit dough, the sound of properly beaten egg whites, and the point at which gravy stopped being liquid and became an obligation. Yet domestic advice often encouraged careful obedience, especially for younger wives still proving that they could manage a household. Following the recipe suggested discipline. Ignoring it suggested confidence only after dinner succeeded. Before that, it suggested danger. A woman could say she cooked by feel, but the family's admiration depended heavily on whether the feeling produced edible results. If the pie crust flaked beautifully, instinct became talent. If it resembled roofing material, everyone suddenly developed an interest in measurements. Creativity was welcome provided it arrived with references. Recipe cards also carried social authority. A dish from your mother could not be dismissed easily because it arrived with memory attached. A recipe from a neighbour might come with the knowledge that she had served it successfully at a luncheon, where 3 women requested copies. Church cookbooks and club collections gathered household reputations into print, each contributor lending her name to rolls, pickles, cakes, casseroles, and desserts. A recipe bearing a respected woman's name arrived with a quiet guarantee, although the guarantee did not cover your oven, your substitutions, or the child who distracted you during the crucial 5 minutes. Women exchanged cards over coffee, copied them by telephone, clipped them from newspapers, and tucked advertising booklets into drawers already crowded with cooking knowledge. The exchange could be warm and generous. It could also contain competition. Asking for a recipe praised the cook. Refusing to share one protected a small area of distinction. Altering a shared recipe and receiving more compliments than the original donor had received created a diplomatic problem best handled by silence and extra whipped cream. The modern recipe system also expanded the menu expected from an ordinary homemaker. Printed guidance made unfamiliar dishes seem achievable. Company booklets introduced meals built around canned soup, packaged gelatin, evaporated milk, frozen vegetables, cake mixes, and other products designed to reduce preparation while preserving the appearance of domestic invention. A woman could try a molded salad, a new casserole, a quick coffee cake, or a dessert promoted as nearly effortless. The difficulty was that convenience did not always replace the older meal. It often joined it. A cake mix still needed eggs, bowls, pans, frosting cleanup, and someone to remember that the cake existed while dinner occupied the stove. A shortcut could save time while raising expectations for variety. Once a recipe was described as quick, simple, and foolproof, failure became especially impolite. The food company had supplied a tested formula. The package had smiled. If the result was disappointing, the kitchen appeared to have identified the remaining variable. There was comfort in the recipe box despite all this. It held more than instructions. A stain could recall a holiday. A card written by a grandmother preserved the shape of her letters after her voice had faded. An altered quantity marked the year the family grew larger. A note reading "useless salt" recorded one dinner nobody wished to repeat. Recipes moved between generations, neighborhoods, racial and immigrant communities, carrying techniques that national advertisements could not standardize completely. Black cooks, immigrant mothers, rural families and working women often preserved food knowledge through oral instruction and handwritten notes that reflected ingredients, budgets, and traditions absent from polished suburban cookbooks. The box was both practical tool and family archive. It contained rules, but it also contained adaptation memory and private authority. A woman whose public choices were limited could still decide how a familiar dish tasted and which knowledge would be passed forward. By late afternoon, the recipe card has survived another meal. A fingerprint of flour rests near the top, and one line has been crossed out in pencil because experience has overruled print. You return the card to its section, although not before adding a small note in the margin, "less milk next time." The measuring cups are washed and nested. The spoons hang from a ring. The bowl dries upside down beside the sink. Dinner may taste exactly as planned, or it may taste better because you quietly corrected the instructions. No one at the table will see the calculation substitutions or moment of doubt when the mixture appeared too thin. They will see a finished dish and perhaps ask how you made it. You may answer that you followed the recipe. This is close enough to the truth. Across the kitchen, the pressure cooker waits on the stove with its lid valve, an impressive belief that modern technology can make dinner faster by placing it under controlled pressure. The resemblance to domestic life is difficult to ignore. The pressure cooker did not merely prepare dinner. It placed dinner under conditions that seemed unusually close to an engineering experiment. Sitting on the stove, it looked heavier and more serious than an ordinary saucepan with thick metal walls, a locking lid, a rubber gasket, and a small regulator balanced over the steam vent like a mechanical bird, deciding whether the kitchen could be trusted. Inside, water and food heated in a sealed space, allowing steam pressure to raise the cooking temperature and soften beans, meat and vegetables more quickly than an open pot could manage. This was the appeal. Foods that normally required hours might be ready in a fraction of the time. The pressure cooker promised economy, speed, tenderness, and modern control. It also hissed, rattled, and occasionally released a sharp burst of steam, which gave the impression that the appliance had accepted its domestic assignment while remaining personally opposed to it. You stood nearby with one eye on the clock and the other on the regulator, because a device capable of shortening dinner preparation also seemed capable of shortening the afternoon in a more dramatic way. Using it began with instructions that could not be treated as decorative literature. The lid had to be fitted correctly. The gasket needed to be clean and properly seated. The vent tube could not be clogged by food particles. Enough liquid had to be added to create steam, but the cooker could not be filled beyond the recommended level, particularly when preparing beans grains or foods likely to foam and expand. You checked the mechanism, added the ingredients, secured the lid, and turned on the heat. For several quiet minutes nothing visible happened. Then steam began to emerge from the vent. The regulator was placed over it, and soon the small weight started rocking or jiggling in a steady rhythm. That motion was reassuring only after experience taught you what reassuring looked and sounded like. Too little movement suggested insufficient pressure. Violent movement suggested excessive heat. The correct state occupied a narrow middle ground in which the cooker sounded active but not offended. You lowered the flame and began counting time. The recipe might say 10 minutes, 15 minutes or longer, but the clock did not begin when the pot touched the stove. It began when full pressure was reached, a distinction capable of separating tender beans from a pan of legumes, still committed to their original firmness. The modern promise was that the cooker would release you from long hours beside the stove. The practical reality was that it demanded a different kind of attention. An ordinary pot could be opened, stirred, tasted, and corrected. A sealed pressure cooker offered no such casual conversation. Once the lid was locked and pressure had built, you could not lift it to see whether the carrots looked cheerful. You had to trust the measured liquid, the timing, the heat, the condition of the gasket, and your memory of the instructions. This could feel liberating. It could also feel like sending dinner into a metal chamber and waiting for official results. The appliance turned cooking into prediction. Too little time left meat tough and vegetables stubborn. Too much time could reduce carrots to orange evidence and potatoes to a substance with no remaining political independence. Opening the cooker early was not an option. The contents existed beyond observation, developing their final texture while the family asked when dinner would be ready. You answered with confidence because the alternative was explaining that supper was currently sealed under pressure and no longer accepting visitors. Releasing that pressure required patience method and resistance to curiosity. Some recipes called for the cooker to cool naturally, allowing pressure to fall gradually, while the pot rested away from direct heat. Others permitted a faster method depending on the food and the manufacturer's instructions. What mattered was that the lid remained locked until the pressure had dropped completely. The regulator might be lifted cautiously with a utensil if the instructions allowed it, releasing a strong stream of steam that could burn skin almost instantly. The lid was then opened away from the face because the remaining heat had no interest in your complexion. Experienced cooks learned the sequence until it became ordinary. Remove from heat, weight check, the pressure release carefully, turn the lid, lift it away. The danger was manageable when the equipment was maintained and the directions followed. Yet stories of clogged vents, damaged gaskets, forced lids, or startling releases of food and steam travelled efficiently through families and neighbourhoods. Every woman seemed to know someone whose cooker had behaved badly, although the details grew more spectacular with distance. By the third retelling, supper had usually reached the ceiling. Fear did not prevent the pressure cooker from being useful. For a household watching the fuel bill or trying to prepare dried beans, stews, tougher cuts of meat soups or vegetables on a crowded schedule, faster cooking could matter greatly. A working woman arriving home late might appreciate a device that reduced the time between raw ingredients and a complete meal. A rural family could use it alongside other preservation and cooking routines. A large household might depend on it to soften economical ingredients without keeping the stove occupied for half the day. The cooker's value was not imaginary. It could save fuel and make certain foods practical on days when ordinary simmering took too long. The contradiction was that advertisements and demonstrations often presented the saved time as leisure, while households frequently converted it into additional productivity. If dinner required 40 fewer minutes, those minutes might be used to wash clothes, iron shirts, supervise homework, prepare dessert, clean the bathroom, or attempt another recipe. The appliance saved time. The household immediately applied for custody of it. Pressure cookers also created a small hierarchy of competence. A woman who used one confidently could appear impressively modern, economical and technically skilled. She understood heat timing seals steam and the behavior of several foods under conditions invisible from the outside. A younger cook might approach the appliance with greater caution, reading the booklet repeatedly and checking the vent as though preparing a small aircraft for departure. Advice could come from a mother, neighbor home economics teacher, demonstration agent, or experienced friend who insisted that the machine was perfectly safe when treated properly. This reassurance was usually followed by a story explaining exactly what happened when it was not. Skill made the process less frightening, but skill itself was rarely acknowledged as anything remarkable. Operating a pressurized metal vessel in a room full of children, sharp knives, boiling liquids, and dinner expectations was classified as ordinary housekeeping. A man performing comparable mechanical work might be described as technically capable. A woman did it while remembering to thaw tomorrow's meat. The appliance demanded maintenance after the meal as well. The vent needed inspection. The lid and pot required careful washing. Food residue had to be removed without damaging the ceiling surfaces. The gasket could harden, stretch, crack, or begin to fit poorly over time, creating another object that the homemaker was expected to monitor before failure occurred. The regulator should remain clean. The cooker had to be dried and stored so that odors and moisture did not collect inside. Some women kept the lid resting loosely rather than locked in place, allowing air to circulate. None of this work was especially dramatic, but domestic labor rarely announced itself at the dramatic stage. It lived in inspection, memory cleaning, replacement, and prevention. When the cooker worked correctly, the family saw tender meat and vegetables. They did not see the vent checked against the light or the gasket examined for weakness. Reliability looked effortless because the person maintaining it removed every visible sign of uncertainty. At last, the pressure has fallen, the lid turns, and a cloud of steam rises toward the ceiling. Inside, the meat is tender, the vegetables are soft, and the broth carries the concentrated smell of a meal that seems to have spent all afternoon cooking, even though the clock insists otherwise. You stir cautiously, adjust the seasoning, and transfer the food to a serving dish before anyone can ask whether the machine frightened you. Perhaps it did the first few times. Perhaps it still does slightly. But the cooker has delivered what it promised: speed, economy, and a meal that appears patient despite having been produced under pressure. This makes it a remarkably suitable appliance for the decade. You clean the lid, check the vent, and place the cooker aside. Tomorrow's recipe may require no such machinery. It may begin with a can opener, a package label, and the cheerful suggestion that condensed soup can solve nearly every problem previously assigned to sauce. Convenience food did not merely enter the 1950s kitchen. It arrived with instructions, illustrations, and the confident assurance that a can of condensed soup has been waiting all along to reorganize dinner. On the pantry shelf stood brightly labeled tins of tomato, mushroom, chicken, celery, and vegetable soup, each compact enough to suggest efficiency and versatile enough, according to company recipe departments, to participate in nearly any meal. Soup could become sauce. Sauce could become casserole. Casserole could become proof that you had embraced modern living without abandoning the expectation of a hot family dinner. Nearby waited boxes of flavored gelatin in jewel-like colors, canned fruit, evaporated milk, packaged pudding cake mix, and small recipe booklets printed by the companies that sold them. These foods promised consistency. They reduced peeling, chopping, simmering, and the possibility that a white sauce might form lumps at exactly the moment guests arrived. They also created an entirely new domestic responsibility. You were expected to transform factory-made ingredients into something that looked personal. Opening the can was easy. Making the family believe the result represented imagination required additional management. Condensed soup was particularly talented at changing occupations. Diluted with milk or water, it behaved like soup. Poured undiluted over meat, vegetables, noodles, or rice, it became a sauce with almost no discussion. Mixed with canned tuna peas, noodles, and crumbs, It helped create a casserole sturdy enough to feed a family and survive several minutes of distracted baking. Mushroom soup could appear over pork chops, chicken, green beans, potatoes, or anything else willing to accept a pale, creamy future. The appeal was practical. Making a traditional sauce required fat flour liquid, careful stirring seasoning, and the possibility of failure. A condensed soup offered thickness, salt flavor, and predictability in one cylindrical package. Yet the shortcut did not remove the meal around it. You still opened cans, drained vegetables, cooked noodles, chopped onions, greased the baking dish, assembled layers, crushed crackers, or scattered breadcrumbs heated the oven, washed the utensils and found a place for the casserole dish afterward. The advertisement showed one cheerful spoonful joining several ingredients. The sink received the complete production history. Food companies understood that selling an ingredient once was useful, but teaching women to use it repeatedly was better. Labels, magazines, newspaper advertisements, demonstration kitchens, promotional pamphlets, and company cookbooks supplied recipes designed around branded products. The recipe appeared helpful, and often it was. It also functioned as a shopping list written by the manufacturer. A single can of soup might require packaged noodles, canned vegetables, processed cheese crackers, and another company product for dessert. The homemaker was invited to be creative inside a carefully arranged commercial system. She could combine, garnish, mold, chill bake, and decorate, but the central ingredient had already been chosen for her. This did not mean women were passive or easily fooled. Many adapted the recipes, rejected unsuccessful ones, substituted cheaper products, or used the basic idea without loyalty to a particular brand. Still, the influence was powerful. The modern kitchen increasingly received its instructions not only from mothers and grandmothers, but from corporations equipped with test kitchens, photographers' marketing departments, and a deep concern for the emotional well-being of unsold inventory. Gelatin offered even greater possibilities because it could suspend food in place. A packet of powder dissolved in hot water accepted cold liquid and then entered the refrigerator as a bowl of uncertainty. Several hours later, it emerged firm, glossy, and capable of holding fruit, vegetables, cottage cheese, mayonnaise, seafood, olives, nuts, or nearly any ingredient that had failed to escape during preparation. Gelatin salads were not invented in the 1950s, but package-flavored gelatin and promotional recipes helped make molded dishes especially visible in mid-century entertaining and domestic imagery. A ring mold could be turned onto a platter garnished with lettuce and presented as though geometry itself had joined the luncheon. Bright lime orange, cherry, and lemon colours looked modern beneath electric light. The mould was cool, clean-edged, and orderly. Every ingredient remained exactly where it had been placed, a condition rarely achieved by children or relatives. It was food as architecture, and the kitchen had finally acquired zoning laws. The difficult moment came when the mould had to leave the pan. You dipped the bottom briefly in warm water, loosened the edge with a knife, placed a serving plate over the top, and turned both together with controlled confidence. Then came the pause. Perhaps the gelatin released immediately with a soft, satisfying movement. Perhaps it remained attached while gravity reconsidered its obligations. You lifted the mould slightly, listened, and lowered it again. Too much heat could soften the exterior and create a shining collapse. Too little could leave half the dish in the mould and half on the platter, a presentation style rarely included in the booklet. When the release succeeded, the result looked impressive for the cost and effort involved. When it failed, you reshaped the edges, added lettuce, applied whipped topping, or described the dish as a salad rather than a sculpture. Garnish existed partly to provide beauty and partly to prevent further questions. These recipes were often treated as evidence that the modern homemaker could offer variety without spending the entire day cooking. Cake mixes reduced measuring. Instant pudding shortened dessert. Frozen vegetables avoided washing and trimming. Canned fruit remained dependable regardless of season. Evaporated milk waited patiently in the cupboard. The benefits were real, especially for women balancing household duties with paid employment, limited transportation, small budgets, unpredictable schedules, or little cooking experience. Packaged ingredients could make meals easier and more reliable, yet convenience changed the standard. If dessert had become simple, perhaps dessert should appear more often. If casseroles were quick, perhaps the dinner menu should become more varied. If gelatin could be prepared in advance, perhaps lunch for guests should include a molded salad rather than an ordinary bowl of fruit. The saved labour did not always become rest. Frequently, it became another dish. The food industry promised to free the homemaker from the stove, then handed her a booklet containing 27 new reasons to return to it. The recipes also carried a particular vision of respectability. Many promotional images centered on white middle-class families in modern kitchens with spacious counters, reliable refrigeration matching dishes, and money available for several packaged ingredients at once. Real households adapted the products unevenly. Working-class cooks compared the cost of convenience foods with basic ingredients. Rural families combined packaged goods with home-preserved produce. Black families and immigrant households used new products alongside food traditions shaped by region, migration, religion, and community. Some recipes entered family life permanently. Others were prepared once discussed carefully and allowed to disappear. A company could print a dish, photograph it beautifully, and call it a family favorite. The family retained veto power. Children were especially effective reviewers, though their comments lacked professional restraint. A casserole rejected by 3 children did not become more successful because a test kitchen had described it as irresistible. There was still pleasure in experimentation. A new recipe could break the monotony of weekly meals. A colourful dessert might delight children. A dependable casserole could rescue a busy evening or feed unexpected guests. Women exchanged successful packaged food recipes at church suppers, club meetings, office lunches, and over backyard fences. They altered seasonings, added familiar ingredients, removed unpopular ones, and converted advertising into household knowledge. The corporation supplied the starting point. The cook decided whether it survived. Over time, some branded recipes became so familiar that families remembered them as tradition rather than marketing. A dish made from canned soup could carry memories of holidays, funerals, reunions, and grandparents' kitchens. Commercial origin did not prevent emotional meaning. It simply meant that memory had arrived with a label. By evening, the casserole stands on the table beneath a browned layer of crumbs, and a molded salad waits nearby with a small ring of lettuce around its base. The meal looks complete, colourful, and unmistakably modern. Someone compliments the casserole, someone else studies the gelatin with the respectful caution normally offered to unfamiliar machinery. You serve both without mentioning the advertisement that inspired them or the small repair made when the mould refused to release cleanly. The family sees dinner. The food company sees successful product integration. You see 3 cans, 2 mixing bowls, a baking dish, a saucepan, several spoons, and another round of washing. Convenience has delivered exactly what it promised, provided no one asks where the saved time went. Tomorrow's challenge will be less colourful but more persistent. The grocery budget must predict every breakfast, lunch, dinner visitor appetite and domestic surprise before the week has even begun. The grocery budget was not merely a list of prices. It was a forecast for a week that had not yet happened. On Friday evening or Saturday morning you sat at the kitchen table with a pencil, a folded store, circular, several recipe cards, and the small amount of money that had to become breakfast-packed lunches, dinners, snacks, cleaning supplies, and enough emergency food to prevent an unexpected visitor from discovering that the cupboard was mortal. The children would be hungry, but not at predictable levels. Your husband might invite someone home from work, a neighbour could stop by during coffee, a school event might require cookies, milk could sour, bread could disappear, or a roast expected to produce 3 meals might be consumed enthusiastically at the first. You wrote down eggs, flour coffee, canned tomatoes, potatoes, onions, milk bread, shortening, and whatever meat the week could reasonably support. Then you added the things everyone claimed were essential, and began removing the things the arithmetic disagreed with. Grocery planning was less like shopping, and more like negotiating a peace treaty between appetite and wages. The first problem was that a menu existed in the future while the money existed only once. You might plan oatmeal and toast for several morning sandwiches for school lunches, a roast on Sunday, meatloaf on Tuesday, beans or soup later in the week, and one dinner built around whatever remained. The most expensive ingredients needed multiple assignments. A chicken could provide a Sunday meal, Monday sandwiches and stock for soup. Ground meat could be stretched with breadcrumbs, oats, rice, or chopped vegetables. Potatoes could appear mashed, fried, baked, scalloped, or mixed into hash, until the family began to suspect they were living beside a commercial farm. Seasonal produce and store specials could shift the plan. A lower price on canned peas might influence 3 meals. A good deal on flour could justify baking bread, biscuits, or cake, assuming the savings were not consumed by the additional butter, egg, sugar, and time required. Every bargain had supporting expenses. The grocery advertisement displayed one attractive number. The kitchen had to calculate the surrounding consequences. Shopping itself required discipline because the store had developed several ways to challenge the list. Bright packages lined the shelves. End displays suggested that canned fruit cake mix, breakfast cereal, or instant coffee had suddenly become urgent. Children noticed illustrated boxes positioned at their eye level and developed immediate loyalties to products they had never tasted. Demonstrations and free samples introduced foods that seemed affordable in one bite and less so by the package. The modern supermarket offered freedom of choice, but it also arranged that freedom beneath fluorescent lights with shopping carts large enough to encourage optimism. You moved through produce, meat, dairy, canned goods, and household supplies while adding prices in your head or marking them on paper. A few cents saved on one item could permit another purchase. A few unexpected increases could remove dessert from the week. The cart slowly became a visible version of the family budget. It held what the household would eat, what it could afford, and what you hoped nobody would request after you reached the checkout. Meat required particular attention because it carried both cost and expectation. A dinner centered on meat could signify that the family was eating properly, even when the portion available for each person was modest. You examined cuts, weights, fat bones, and prices, looking beyond the package toward the meals it might become. A cheaper roast could require longer cooking. A bone-in cut offered less edible meat but might create stock. Ground beef was flexible, though flexibility encouraged repeated appearances. Organ meat, stewing cuts, canned fish, beans, eggs, and casseroles provided economical alternatives, but family preferences could turn thrift into a public debate. The ideal homemaker was expected to respect the budget without making dinner feel like punishment. She could not simply announce that meat cost too much and place a bowl of lentils on the table with a financial statement. The meal needed familiarity seasoning and enough confidence to prevent everyone from looking toward the center of the plate for something that was not there. Economy was most successful when it avoided mentioning itself. Then came the reserve against bad luck. A sensible pantry held more than the exact ingredients required by the menu. There should be canned soup crackers, tuna fruit beans, flour, sugar coffee, evaporated milk, and perhaps a cake mix or package of cookies that could become hospitality on short notice. These supplies protected the household from illness, weather, transportation problems, late pay, sudden guests, and the child who remembered at 8 in the evening that tomorrow's class required 24 cupcakes. Stocking ahead created security, but stocking too much tied money up on the shelf. Buying too little created risk. The homemaker had to identify the correct point between preparedness and extravagance, a point that moved whenever prices, family needs, or storage space changed. A full pantry could feel comforting. It could also conceal forgotten cans pushed to the back until their labels faded into a previous era. The goal was not to own food. It was to own exactly the right food before anyone knew it was needed. Guests made prediction especially difficult because hospitality carried expectations of abundance. If relatives arrived on Sunday afternoon, coffee alone might feel insufficient. You needed cake, cookies, sandwiches, or ingredients capable of becoming something presentable quickly. A husband who invited a colleague home might offer the invitation with the relaxed generosity of a man who believed dinner expanded naturally when another chair appeared. You checked the roast, counted the potatoes, opened another can of vegetables, added bread to the table, and adjusted portions without allowing the guest to sense the emergency. The family understood that second helpings might be limited, though ideally this message travelled through facial expression rather than speech. A capable hostess made the meal look planned. She did not reveal that one pie had been cut into thinner slices, or that the gravy had recently received additional water and renewed encouragement. Generosity mattered, and many women took pride in providing it. The burden came from being expected to manufacture abundance from resources that had already been assigned. Class, region, race, and access shaped every version of this calculation. A family with a car and a large refrigerator could shop differently from a household relying on neighborhood stores, buses, or small icebox space. Rural families might grow vegetables, keep chickens, preserve fruit, or buy staples in larger quantities, but those practices required land labor, equipment, and time. Black families facing unequal wages, segregated neighborhoods, and restricted access to credit or supermarkets often paid more for fewer choices, while still carrying the same cultural expectations to feed children well and welcome guests. Working women planned around shifts and commuting. Families receiving irregular wages could not rely on a smooth weekly pattern. Immigrant households combined American products with familiar staples and food traditions that understood thrift long before advertising departments discovered it. The polished magazine menu assumed stable income, nearby stores, reliable appliances, and several uninterrupted hours for cooking. Real kitchens adjusted the promise to fit the circumstances. At the end of the shopping trip, the cashier totals the purchases while you watch the numbers climb. A can is removed. A luxury becomes unnecessary. Perhaps the total lands just below the amount in your purse, leaving a few coins and a feeling of a narrow victory. At home, the groceries are unpacked according to a plan that only you can see. Milk enters the refrigerator. Cans join the pantry. Meat is divided by meal. Bread is placed where children cannot crush it beneath school books. The kitchen now contains 7 days of possibility, but none of it has cooked itself. The budget has predicted hunger visitors, lunches shortages, and one modest dessert. Whether the family cooperates remains uncertain. To make the forecast hold certain meals will need to appear on certain days, and predictability will become its own domestic rule. Tuesday's meatloaf is already waiting in the arithmetic. A weekly menu was not merely a plan for food. It was a way of convincing the household that the future had been organized. Monday might use what remained from Sunday. Tuesday could belong to meatloaf. Wednesday might bring bean soup or a casserole. Friday often carried religious or family traditions involving fish or another meatless meal depending on the household. Saturday allowed something simpler, especially if errand shopping or social plans had consumed the afternoon. The exact pattern varied by region, religion, class, income, and family preference, but the comfort of repetition was widely understandable. Everyone knew what certain days tasted like. You knew which ingredients to buy, which dishes could be prepared ahead, and which leftovers would naturally become the next meal. The weekly menu reduced uncertainty, at least in theory. It also meant that by Tuesday morning, while wiping breakfast crumbs from the table, you already understood that ground meat, onion, breadcrumbs, egg and seasoning were waiting to become a loaf by late afternoon. The family might consider this tradition. You considered it scheduling. Meatloaf was well suited to the arithmetic of domestic life. Ground meat could be extended with breadcrumbs, cracker crumbs, oats, milk, egg, grated vegetables, or whatever familiar recipe the household accepted without formal protest. The mixture was worked together in a bowl pressed into a metal loaf pan, or shaped by hand in a baking dish, then covered with tomato sauce, ketchup, gravy, or another topping regarded as correct by the family. Every kitchen seemed to possess its own rules about texture. Too much filler and the loaf tasted economical in a way nobody praised. Too little, and the meal became more expensive than the week had authorized. Over-mixing could make it dense. Too little mixing allowed ingredients to separate into visible territories. The ideal loaf held together when sliced remained moist, and produced enough portions for dinner with perhaps a little left for sandwiches. It was reliable, filling, and flexible. It was also brown rectangular, and difficult to photograph as a symbol of post-war excitement, though advertising departments made heroic attempts. Predictable meals gave the homemaker practical advantages. She could soak beans the night before thaw meat at the correct time, save stale bread for crumbs, prepare a dessert that matched the oven schedule, and arrange the grocery list around ingredients that served more than one purpose. Potatoes bought for Tuesday could return later in soup or hash. Celery used in a casserole could appear in lunch sandwiches. A large cabbage might provide slaw-cooked vegetables, and enough remaining leaves to create a mild sense that cabbage had joined the household permanently. Planning reduced waste and helped avoid the late afternoon question of what to cook, a question capable of becoming surprisingly hostile when accompanied by hungry children and a nearly empty refrigerator. Yet planning also transferred responsibility for every future appetite onto the person holding the pencil. If the family grew tired of a dish, the menu had failed. If ingredients spoiled before their assigned day, the schedule had failed. If someone ate the lunch meat intended for Thursday, the calendar did not confront him. You did. Repetition could feel comforting because familiar food asked little from the people eating it. A child knew how the meatloaf should taste. A husband recognized the gravy. The serving bowls appeared in their usual places, and the family moved through the meal without needing to examine every ingredient. This familiarity mattered in a decade often associated with rapid change. New suburbs, new schools, new appliances, new roads, new consumer goods, and new anxieties arriving through radio and television. A predictable dinner could make the evening feel stable. The smell of onions browning in a skillet, potatoes boiling beneath a rattling lid, or a loaf baking in the oven, told the family that the house remained intact and the day was approaching its expected conclusion. Women could take real satisfaction in creating that rhythm. A meal repeated every week might become a child's permanent memory of home. The emotional value was genuine. So was the boredom experienced by the person required to produce the memory on schedule. The menu also created a quiet boundary around experimentation. A new recipe might be interesting, but it risked wasting ingredients and provoking resistance. Tuesday's known meatloaf was safer than a dish clipped from a magazine whose photograph had been assisted by lighting, styling and ingredients behaving under professional supervision. You could change the seasoning slightly, add a different topping or place vegetables around the loaf, but too much innovation might cause the table to investigate. Familiar food allowed the cook to work efficiently because she knew the sequence mix, shape, bake, boil, drain, mash, serve. An unfamiliar recipe required reading, measuring, checking, and hoping. When the budget was narrow, there was little room for a dinner everyone refused. A homemaker was encouraged to provide variety, but not the kind of variety that made anyone uncomfortable. She was expected to prevent monotony without disturbing familiarity, which was a delicate assignment for a meal made from the same ingredients every Tuesday. Day-of-the-week meals could also reflect schedules beyond the kitchen. Laundry day might call for something that simmered while sheets and clothing demanded attention. Shopping day might produce a meal based on the freshest purchase, or something quick enough to follow an afternoon away from home. Church activities, school events, payday, a husband's work hours and children's lessons all shaped what could be cooked and when. In households where women held paid jobs, menus might depend on what could be prepared before work reheated afterward, or assembled quickly once everyone returned home. Rural families arranged meals around farm labour and seasonal abundance. Catholic families might observe meatless Fridays with fish eggs, macaroni or other dishes, while other religious and cultural traditions created their own weekly patterns. There was no single national menu, despite the confidence of magazines that occasionally appeared to have planned dinner for an entire continent. What many households shared was the need to make food obey time. The family rarely saw the weekly structure as a whole. They experienced one meal at a time. You experienced the chain connecting them. Tuesday's crumbs might come from bread saved on Monday. Wednesday's soup could depend on bones from Sunday. Thursday's casserole might use vegetables purchased because they were discounted on Saturday. One meal leaned quietly into the next, supported by storage memory and the ability to notice what needed using. This continuity made the household economical, but it could also make the kitchen feel endless. Dinner was never only dinner. It was the conclusion of previous decisions and the beginning of tomorrow's preparation. While the meatloaf baked, you checked whether enough milk remained for breakfast, whether the lunch containers were clean, and whether the last two slices could be protected from second helpings without appearing ungenerous. Domestic planning required you to be present at the table while mentally living 3 meals ahead. At 6 o'clock, the meatloaf reaches the table beside mashed potatoes, vegetables, and gravy. The slices hold together. The topping has browned slightly at the edges. The meal looks familiar enough to calm the room. Someone asks for more potatoes. Someone reaches for the ketchup before tasting anything. For a few minutes, the weekly plan appears successful. The family eats what was expected on the day it was expected, and predictability feels almost like peace. Then one child looks down at the plate, presses a fork into the meatloaf and announces that he does not like it anymore. The statement is delivered casually as though personal taste has no relationship to the grocery budget the afternoon's work, or the fact that he liked the same meal 7 days earlier. The weekly menu has met its most unpredictable ingredient. It has met the child. A child refusing dinner was not merely expressing a preference. At the 1950s table, it could become a small referendum on appetite discipline, gratitude, nutrition manners, and the mother who had prepared the plate. The meatloaf sits beneath a stripe of tomato topping. The potatoes have been mashed smooth. The green beans have been warmed, buttered, and placed at a safe distance from the gravy. Nothing is burned. Nothing is missing. Yet one child presses the fork into the loaf, looks at the compressed edge and announces that he does not like it. The statement lands in the quiet between the clink of silverware and the evening radio murmuring from the next room. Last Tuesday he ate 2 slices. Tonight he has apparently developed principles. Your husband lowers the newspaper or pauses over his plate. Another child watches with the alert interest of someone observing a possible escape route. You ask him to take a bite. He says he is not hungry. This is unlikely, because 20 minutes earlier he was searching the bread box with the intensity of a customs inspector. The meal has become a contest, and the person most likely to be judged is not the person refusing it. Many families expected children to eat what was served, remain at the table, and show appreciation whether or not appreciation was naturally present. The exact rules varied widely. Some parents required 1 bite. Others required a clean plate. Some allowed disliked foods to remain untouched but prohibited requests for alternatives. In stricter households, the child might sit until the plate was finished, or until the evening had become uncomfortable for everyone. The rule could be explained as thrift, obedience, nutrition, good manners, or respect for the labour behind the meal. Each explanation contained some truth. Food cost money. Waste mattered. Children needed nourishment. Preparing separate dishes for every opinion was unrealistic. Yet the expectation also made appetite a matter of character. Refusing vegetables might be treated as stubbornness. Disliking liver could become ingratitude. A child who asked what else was available was often informed that nothing else was available, a response intended both as information and constitutional law. The kitchen was not a restaurant. This phrase would survive for generations because it was efficient, memorable, and delivered best while pointing toward a cooling plate. Nutrition advice added another layer of responsibility. Parents encountered guidance through doctors, schools' home economics materials, government publications, magazines, food companies, and public campaigns, encouraging balanced meals, milk consumption, vegetables, protein, and orderly eating habits. The details changed over time and families interpreted them differently, but the mother was often positioned as the household's nutritional manager. She selected the food, planned the portions, encouraged the children and carried the blame if they appeared too thin, too heavy, tired, pale, fussy, or unusually uninterested in carrots. A child's body became another report card issued to her. If he ate poorly, perhaps she had indulged him. If she forced him, perhaps the meal became unpleasant. If she offered a substitute, she risked teaching bad habits. If she did not, she might worry he would go to bed hungry. The advice often appeared clear on paper because the paper did not contain a 7-year-old who just decided that gravy looked suspicious. You try persuasion first, 1 bite, then 2. Perhaps the meatloaf is cut into smaller pieces. Perhaps potatoes are placed on top. Perhaps the green beans are moved farther away so their influence can be reduced. You mention dessert, though. Using sweets as a reward may contradict the same guidance that's told you to encourage healthy habits. You remind him that other children would be grateful for this food, a comparison large enough to end most debates while solving none of them. Your husband may support you with a firmer instruction, or he may say the boy will eat when he is hungry, leaving you to determine what that policy means at bedtime. The child studies the fork studies the meatloaf. Time slows. Dinner continues around the dispute, but the atmosphere has tightened. One resistant bite now carries the weight of parental unity, maternal competence, and whether the family table will remain orderly. The meatloaf did not request this authority. It is doing its best. The mother's position was especially difficult because she was expected to control the meal without appearing controlling. A pleasant family dinner belonged to the ideal home with children eating neatly, parents conversing warmly, and no one treating peas as a hostile force. If a child misbehaved in public or refused food at a relative's house, the behavior could be interpreted as evidence of poor training. Other adults might offer advice with the calm confidence available only to people whose own children were not currently present. Perhaps you gave him too many snacks. Perhaps you did not introduce vegetables early enough. Perhaps you were too soft. Perhaps you were too anxious. A grandmother might recall that her children ate whatever was placed before them, a historical claim difficult to verify and dangerous to challenge. The child's temperament, fatigue, sensory dislikes illness, or simple desire for control received less attention than the question of whether his mother had managed him correctly. His appetite belonged to him. Its social meaning belonged to her. There were practical reasons dinner resistance felt so personal. The meal represented hours of planning, shopping, saving, chopping, cooking, and timing. Refusal could make that labor feel rejected even when the child intended no such insult. He was responding to taste, texture, mood, or the sudden discovery that saying no created power in a life full of adult instructions. You, however, saw the grocery money, the leftover bread used as crumbs, the onion chopped while supervising homework, and the pan that still needed washing. It was difficult not to hear, "I don't like it," as your work was pointless. Affection complicated the frustration. You wanted him fed. You also wanted him to learn courtesy. You wanted dinner to remain peaceful. You wanted the other children not to imitate him. You wanted to avoid becoming the mother who prepared 4 separate meals, though there had been no serious danger of this because the kitchen had neither the time nor the diplomatic staff. These conflicts took different forms across households. In families where food was scarce, refusal could be met with sharper anger, because waste represented real risk. In wealthier homes, the pressure might center more on manners, nutrition, and social presentation. Religious traditions, immigrant foodways, regional habits, and family memories shaped which dishes were considered ordinary and which behaviors were acceptable. Some children ate strong flavors, greens, beans, fish, organ meats, or heavily seasoned foods because these were familiar from the beginning. Others resisted anything outside a narrow range. Black immigrant, rural, and working-class mothers often faced mainstream advice that ignored their food traditions while still judging their children's health and conduct. Women working outside the home had even less patience for a rejected dinner after completing a paid shift. There was no single 1950s family table. There were many tables, but at a great number of them, a mother eventually said some version of the same thing, "This is what we are having." Eventually the conflict resolves, though not always through victory. The child eats enough to satisfy the adults, or the plate is removed with a warning that no later snack will appear. Perhaps he returns an hour later claiming hunger and is offered the same meatloaf, now colder and considerably less persuasive. Perhaps you quietly give him bread and milk because principle weakens when bedtime approaches. Whatever happens, the kitchen records the disagreement. A half-eaten slice is covered and placed in the refrigerator. The serving dish holds fewer leftovers than expected, but not for the reason planned. You clear the table and wonder whether next Tuesday should bring something different. The child runs off the dispute, already fading from his memory. For you, it becomes another note in the invisible household file, dislikes meatloaf. This week may accept it next week. Do not allow crackers before dinner. By late afternoon tomorrow, another test will arrive. The clock will move toward 5:30, the front door will soon open, and dinner must be ready not only for the family's appetite, but for the husband's return from work. 5:30 was not simply a time on the clock. It was the hour when the kitchen had to stop looking like a workshop and begin presenting itself as proof that the household was under control. All afternoon the room could contain potato peelings, open flour tins, damp dishcloths, cooling pans, and a woman moving between tasks with an apron marked by honest evidence. But as the hands of the clock approached the husband's return, the evidence had to disappear. Dinner should be close enough to readiness that its smell reached the hallway, but not so finished that it sat drying on the stove. The children should be washed quiet or at least arranged into a condition that could be described as manageable. The counter needed wiping. This sink should not display the full history of meal preparation. You checked the oven stirred, the gravy turned down the vegetables and listened for a car door, a bus in the distance, or familiar footsteps along the front path. The entire evening seemed to depend on timing his arrival, with the moment when dinner looked effortless. He had spent the day at work. You had spent the day preparing the scene in which work would no longer be visible. The meal itself required careful staging. Meat rested beneath foil or remained in the oven with the heat lowered. Potatoes waited beneath a lid where steam kept them warm, while also threatening to make them watery. Vegetables had to be cooked but not exhausted. Gravy needed enough heat to flow and enough thickness to suggest competence. Rolls might be wrapped in a towel butter placed in a dish, and a simple dessert hidden safely from children who interpreted cooling pie as an invitation. The table was set with everyday plates, glasses, silverware, napkins, salt, pepper, and whatever condiment the family considered essential. A missing spoon could be replaced. A missing husband could not be timed. If he arrived 20 minutes late, the kitchen had to preserve dinner without appearing inconvenienced. If he arrived 10 minutes early, you needed to accelerate several processes while smiling, as though the clock had confirmed the arrangement personally. Domestic schedules often treated the husband's return as fixed, even when trains, traffic, overtime, errands, and conversations with colleagues made it uncertain. Dinner was expected to be punctual around a person whose punctuality the kitchen could not control. Then there was your own transformation. The house dress and stained apron that had carried you through breakfast, cleaning, shopping, and cooking could not always be allowed to greet the evening. You washed your hands and face, repaired your hair, added powder or lipstick, and changed into a cleaner dress if time permitted. A fresh apron might go over it while the final dishes were completed, preferably one that suggested attractive domestic activity without containing visible proof of onions, flour, or dishwater. Popular advice and advertising often encouraged wives to appear pleasant and refreshed when husbands returned, as though the day had required no more physical effort than choosing flowers for the table. Some women liked this ritual. Changing clothes could create a genuine boundary between daytime labor and evening family life. The difficulty was that the labor had not ended. You were simply expected to look as though it had. His tired face confirmed that work was demanding. Yours was encouraged to suggest that work had recently been removed with cold cream. The children had their own role in the performance, though they rarely approached it with professional discipline. One needed to stop dragging a toy across the kitchen floor. Another had to wash hands, lower a voice, or finish homework before dinner. A quarrel that had been simmering for 20 minutes needed to be postponed until after the front door opened. The ideal home welcomed the returning wage earner with calm affection and a reasonable distance from domestic chaos. This did not necessarily mean that every husband demanded silence, or that every wife staged his arrival as a formal ceremony. Families varied enormously, and many men returned ready to help joke with the children or discuss the day as equals. Yet the cultural image was persistent. He entered from the difficult public world, and the home restored him. Less attention was given to who restored the person who had spent the day restoring the home. You urged the children to lower their voices, not because their father was a tyrant, but because the household had been taught that his transition mattered in a way yours did not. When the door opens, information begins arriving before coats are removed. His expression tells you whether the day went well. The speed with which he places down the briefcase or lunch container tells you whether conversation should begin immediately or wait until coffee, a drink, or dinner. You greet him, take his coat if that is the household habit, and offer the first piece of evening news in a carefully selected order. A child's minor school problem may wait. The leaking faucet may wait. The grocery bill may certainly wait. The most difficult domestic subjects are rarely introduced while a man is still standing in the doorway. Timing emotional information becomes another branch of kitchen management. You ask about his day. He may answer briefly and ask when dinner will be ready, not necessarily from cruelty, but because the smell has reached him and hunger has reduced his conversational range. Just a few minutes is the safest response, even if those minutes contain draining potatoes, thickening sauce, slicing meat, filling glasses, settling children, and preventing bread from becoming the second toast crisis of the day. The arrangement could offer comfort as well as pressure. A familiar arrival, a hot meal, children gathered near the table, and the transition from workday to evening created a rhythm families genuinely valued. Many wives took pride in making home feel welcoming. Many husbands understood the labor involved even when the culture gave them limited language for acknowledging it. A man arriving from factory work, office, stress, military service, construction, sales, travel, or a long commute might truly need quiet. A woman managing children, errands, cooking and housework might need exactly the same thing. The imbalance was not that his fatigue was imaginary. It was that hers was expected to become hospitality. The home functioned as his refuge because someone else remained on duty. Affection made the work meaningful. Expectation made it compulsory. Both truths could sit at the same table. Economic circumstances altered the ritual sharply. A wife employed outside the home might return at nearly the same time as her husband, and still be expected to produce dinner, supervise children, and restore the house to evening order. Working-class families could not always arrange the polished homecoming shown in advertisements. Shift work, irregular hours, shared transportation, boarders, crowded housing, and limited kitchens changed the schedule. Black women who had spent the day performing domestic labor in other households might arrive home carrying both paid exhaustion and unpaid responsibility. Rural families followed farm work rather than the suburban commuter clock. Some husbands cooked, some children helped, some families ate whenever everyone could gather, and some marriages ignored the ideal entirely. Yet the image of the cheerful wife greeting the returning husband remained powerful, because it condensed an entire social arrangement into one doorway. He crossed the threshold from work into home. She was expected to make the threshold disappear. By 6 o'clock everyone is seated. The meat is sliced, the vegetables are served, and the gravy has survived the delay. Your husband begins eating. The children report fragments of the day. One speaks too loudly. Another requests the part of the meal least available. You sit down last, perhaps only after checking the stove once more and bringing the item everyone assumed was already present. From the table, the kitchen looks warm, orderly and calm. No one sees the apron changed, the sauce rescued, the argument postponed, or the potatoes held together through 20 uncertain minutes. This is the success of the 5:30 rule. The evening begins as though it arranged itself. You take the first full bite of food you've eaten while seated since breakfast, and feel the day slow slightly. But tomorrow the pressure will increase. Dinner will not be served only to family members who already understand the house. Company will be coming, and every plate course pours. And serving spoon will acquire witnesses. Company dinner was not simply supper with additional chairs. It was a temporary public examination conducted with plates serving spoons, napkins, and the dangerous possibility that someone might notice the gravy boat was not part of a matching set. The kitchen began preparing long before the guests arrived. Meat had to be chosen with care, dessert prepared early enough to survive, vegetables timed, so they remained bright rather than surrendering into grey obedience, and every serving dish assigned a purpose before the stove became crowded. The dining table was cleared of school papers, sewing mail, and the ordinary debris of family life then covered with a freshly ironed cloth, whose creases were expected to align with more precision than most road systems. Plates were centered. Forks went to the left, knives and spoons to the right, blades turned inward. Glasses placed above napkins folded neatly, and serving pieces arranged according to a logic that seemed obvious only after someone had explained it several times. The family might eat with mismatched dishes during the week, but company required the good china, the unchipped glasses, and the silverware that had recently been polished into temporary innocence. The meal had not begun yet, the table was already making claims about the household. The menu needed to appear generous without becoming impossible to serve. A roast-baked ham chicken or another respectable centerpiece might anchor the meal, surrounded by potatoes, vegetables, rolls, salad, gravy, and dessert. The exact dishes varied by region, religion, class, season, and the importance of the guests. But the underlying rule was familiar company should not leave hungry, and it should not suspect that feeding it had caused financial distress. You planned portions with caution, then added more. An empty serving dish could suggest popularity, but an empty serving dish appearing too early suggested poor calculation. Leftovers were acceptable. Visible scarcity was not. At the same time, choosing too ambitious a menu could trap the hostess in the kitchen, while everyone else discussed comfortable subjects in the living room. One dish needed basting another, reheating a sauce, thickening rolls, browning, and coffee prepared for later. The ideal company dinner displayed variety while allowing the hostess to participate gracefully. This was achieved mostly through advanced preparation, careful timing, and the quiet abandonment of any dish that became impossible before witnesses arrived. When the doorbell rang, the kitchen had to enter a state of controlled concealment. Dirty preparation bowls were stacked out of sight. Scraps disappeared into the garbage pail. The dishcloth was rinsed and hung neatly. The roasting pan might remain in the oven because it had nowhere else to go and had already seen too much. You removed the working apron, checked your hair, and welcomed the guests with an expression suggesting the meal had assembled itself during a pleasant afternoon. Coats were taken, introductions made, and drinks or small refreshments offered if the household practiced that ritual. Meanwhile, the kitchen continued operating behind the wall. A timer might ring. A child might be instructed to ignore it. The smell of browning rolls could shift from inviting to urgent in less than a minute. You moved between rooms, smiling in one and calculating heat loss in the other. A successful hostess appeared present without ever being absent from the stove. She listened to a guest's story while wondering whether the gravy was forming a skin. Social attention and culinary attention had to occupy the same face. Seating carried its own rules. The host and hostess might sit at opposite ends of the table, particularly for a more formal meal, with guests arranged to encourage conversation and prevent obvious social imbalances. Married couples could be separated so they spoke to other people, a strategy based on the assumption that marriage had already provided sufficient conversation. Children might eat earlier, sit at smaller table, or join the adults only if their manners could survive public observation. Once everyone was seated, dishes could be passed family-style, served by the host and hostess, or brought in courses depending on the formality and resources of the home. The hostess watched the table constantly while pretending not to. Who needed more water? Had the bread reached the far end? Was one guest avoiding the vegetables? Had someone received a smaller slice of meat? A serving spoon left in the wrong dish could transfer sauce where sauce had no invitation. Salt should be passed with pepper in some households, because separating them apparently threatened their emotional well-being. The meal was filled with such small customs, each too minor to justify anxiety and collectively capable of producing it. Conversation needed management as carefully as food. Safe topics included travel, children's achievements, community events, recipes, gardening work that was not too controversial, and the remarkable reliability of the weather as a subject when everything else became dangerous. Money-family disputes, illness, politics, religion, and neighborhood scandal might appear anyway, usually introduced by the guest least burdened by the consequences. The hostess could redirect with a question, offer another helping, or send a dish around the table with the strategic timing of a diplomat moving troops. Silence had to be prevented, but loud disagreement was worse. Children were expected not to interrupt, complain, or reveal private household information. This last rule was especially important because children possessed an instinct for announcing exactly what adults had agreed not to mention. A young voice asking why the good plates were being used only for people the family barely knew could shorten an evening considerably. You smiled past the rolls and trusted that dessert might restore order. The burden became more complicated in homes with paid domestic help. Affluent families might rely on a cook-maid or day worker to prepare food, set the table, serve courses, wash dishes, or manage children, while the hostess received praise for the evening's elegance. In many American communities, black women and immigrant women performed this labor under unequal wages and conditions, often leaving their own households to prepare another family's dinner. Their skill made formal hospitality possible, while social recognition remained limited. Even in homes without live-in staff, a woman might hire help for a special occasion if the budget allowed. The public image centered on the gracious hostess, but the private machinery could include another woman working in the kitchen entering the dining room only to refill plates and then disappearing again. Class determined not only what was served, but who was allowed to look relaxed while serving it. The perfect dinner required labor. Wealth mainly changed whose labor remained visible. For women without help, dinner unfolded as a repeated journey between chair and kitchen. You sat after everyone else, then rose for gravy. You returned, ate 2 bites, and remembered the rolls. A guest accepted more coffee, so the percolator required attention. Dessert plates replaced dinner plates, forks or spoons appeared. Whipped cream was brought in, and crumbs were brushed aside with whatever discretion could be managed. No one intended to make the hostess work continuously. The structure of the meal simply kept assigning her tasks. A husband might carve the meat or pour drinks, and older children could clear dishes, but responsibility for the whole sequence usually remained centered in one mind. If a course arrived late, she knew. If coffee was weak, she knew. If the cake leaned slightly after slicing, she knew long before anyone politely declared it delicious. Guests were often kind. The pressure did not require cruelty. It came from the belief that hospitality revealed character, and that mistakes, however small, revealed something too. At last the guests rise, thank you warmly, and move toward the door. Coats are found. Invitations are exchanged. Someone asks for a recipe which transforms exhaustion into compliment and makes the entire evening feel more successful. The front door closes and the house changes immediately. Smiles soften. Shoes are loosened. The children emerge from wherever they have been contained. In the kitchen, plates stand in towers, glasses crowd the counter. Serving dishes hold the remains of generosity, and the roasting pan waits with the patience of an object that knows you cannot ignore it forever. The company dinner is over for the company. For the hostess, it has entered cleanup. Still, there may be pride beneath the fatigue. The meal held together. Conversation survived. No guest left hungry, and the good tablecloth escaped permanent damage. Tomorrow the same dishes might appear at a church supper or women's gathering, where private recipes would become public evidence, and every casserole would quietly compete for approval. A church supper was not merely a meal served beneath fluorescent lights. It was a public exhibition of private kitchens transported in covered dishes, and arranged along folding tables where everyone could inspect the results without admitting that inspection was occurring. By late afternoon, you carried a casserole wrapped in towels, a pie protected beneath a metal carrier, or a salad balanced carefully enough to make every turn in the road feel personal. The church basement smelled of coffee, floor wax warm rolls, baked onions, and several competing versions of cream sauce. Folding chairs scraped across linoleum. Children moved between adults until someone assigned them a table at the far end of the room. Women in clean dresses and cardigans placed their dishes beside handwritten labels serving spoons and small slips of paper bearing family names. The food was communal, but it was not anonymous. Everyone knew who had brought the ham whose rolls rose highest, which woman could be trusted with pie crust, and whose gelatin creation appeared to contain information the congregation was not prepared to receive. The church supper offered fellowship, charity, and enough quiet comparison to keep the serving line moving efficiently. Choosing what to bring required strategy. The dish needed to travel well, remain edible while waiting, serve enough people, and survive the possibility that the kitchen ovens were already occupied by 6 other women reheating casseroles at incompatible temperatures. Something too simple could appear careless. Something too elaborate could appear boastful, especially if it required lengthy explanation before serving. A dependable casserole was safe because it could be prepared ahead, covered tightly and placed on a hot table without collapsing emotionally. Baked beans, scalloped potatoes, macaroni dishes, fried chicken, sliced ham, deviled eggs, slaws, pickles, moulded salads, cakes, pies, and rolls all had their supporters. Regional traditions, church denomination, season income, and family background shaped the table. The best choice was often a dish already associated with your name because reputation reduced risk. If people expected your apple cake, arriving with experimental seafood salad might create unnecessary theological questions. Familiarity reassured the congregation. Innovation was welcome, mainly after someone else had tested it at home. The serving line made every contribution briefly public. People moved past the table holding heavy plates, deciding which foods deserved space and which could be admired from a respectful distance. A popular dish emptied quickly, leaving only crumb streaks of sauce and the complement of an exposed pan. A less successful contribution remained nearly complete, its serving spoon resting at the same angle throughout the evening. No one announced the rankings, but the evidence was available. You could watch someone pause before your casserole, take a careful portion, and then either return later or continue living without it. Compliments mattered. Who made this was the highest form of recognition, because it separated the cook from the crowded table. That's interesting occupied a different category entirely. Women praised one another, sincerely exchanged tips, and encouraged younger cooks, but competition could exist beneath genuine warmth. Food offered one of the few socially approved areas where domestic skill became visible beyond the family. At-home dinner disappeared into ordinary expectation. In the church basement, an empty pie plate could function almost like a certificate. Recipe exchange began before the dishes had cooled. A woman might ask how you kept the cake moist, whether the casserole used canned soup, or what gave the pickles their particular bite. You recited the ingredients from memory, promised to write them down, or explained that the recipe was very simple, while omitting the 3 adjustments that made it reliable. Cards appeared from handbags. Measurements were copied on the backs of church bulletins. Telephone numbers were added so one missing instruction could be clarified later. Recipes travelled between families through these informal networks, changing slightly with every kitchen. A cup became a generous cup. Butter replaced shortening. Onion was reduced for one husband and doubled for another. The recipe might eventually appear in a mimeographed or printed church cookbook, placed beneath the contributor's name, and sold to support a building fund missionary program school or women's organization. Once printed, the dish acquired authority. A recipe that had survived years of private alteration suddenly looked permanent in ink, even when everyone knew the original card contained a correction written diagonally across the margin. The cookbook was more than a collection of meals. It was a map of relationships. Names connected recipes to mothers, grandmothers, neighbours, choir members, committee leaders, and women remembered after death through the dishes they had served repeatedly. Several recipes might be nearly identical, differing only in pan size or the amount of sugar, yet removing one could feel like removing the contributor herself. Advertised convenience products often appeared beside older family methods, showing how packaged soup gelatin cake mix and canned fruit entered established traditions rather than simply replacing them. A handwritten recipe could become communal memory prepared at funerals, births, sickroom visits, and family reunions long after its first contributor had stopped attending supper. The emotional meaning was real. So was the labour behind producing the book, collecting cards, deciphering handwriting, typing instructions, correcting omissions, organising categories, raising money and deciding diplomatically whether bake until ready counted as sufficient guidance. The finished booklet carried everyone's names. A smaller group of women had quietly rescued it from chaos. Church kitchens also revealed how much community hospitality depended on unpaid organisation. Someone ordered coffee, counted plates, arranged tables, located serving utensils, checked the oven, collected money, directed children, washed pots, and remembered which family needed food taken home. These tasks were often assigned through women's circles, altar societies, auxiliary groups or committees whose members knew how to transform a basement into a dining room before most guests arrived. Their work could support genuine fellowship and mutual aid. Church suppers raised funds, welcomed newcomers, fed grieving families, celebrated weddings, and provided meals when illness or hardship disrupted a household. Yet the same women who cooked at home were expected to cook publicly, serve politely and clean afterward often, while men handled announcements, finances, or visible leadership. The division was not identical in every congregation, and many men carried tables, carved meat, poured coffee, or washed dishes. Still, a remarkable amount of religious community life rested on women who were praised for devotion rather than paid for logistics. The casseroles had entered church service. Race and class changed the meaning of these gatherings. Black churches frequently served as centres of community organisation, mutual aid, political discussion, music education, and social life, making shared meals part of networks that extended far beyond Sunday worship. Black churchwomen brought culinary traditions shaped by region, migration, family memory, and the unequal economic conditions surrounding them, while also exercising real community authority through organising and fundraising. Catholic parishes, rural Protestant churches, immigrant congregations, and urban neighbourhood churches developed their own food customs, calendars, and expectations. Some tables reflected farm abundance, others depended on inexpensive dishes stretched for large crowds. Wealthier congregations might possess spacious kitchens and matching equipment, while smaller churches relied on borrowed roasters, home ovens, and volunteers carrying food through rain. The ideal of fellowship could soften social boundaries, but it did not erase them. Who prepared the food, who served first, whose recipes were treated as refined, and whose labour was taken for granted, could reflect the larger society beyond the basement walls. At the end of the evening, the public meal became private evidence again. You returned to the serving table and examined what remained. An empty dish brought satisfaction. A nearly full one required interpretation. Perhaps it had been placed too far down the line after everyone's plates were crowded. Perhaps another casserole looked similar. Perhaps the congregation had simply reached its limit of mayonnaise. You covered the leftovers, accepted another compliment, and offered portions to anyone willing to take them home. Around you, tablecloths were folded chairs, stacked coffee urns emptied, and women stood at deep sinks washing pans large enough to bathe a cooperative child. The room slowly lost its warmth and returned to fluorescent quiet. You carried your dish back to the car lighter than before, and perhaps accompanied by 3 new recipe cards tucked into your purse. The supper had fed the congregation, raised money, exchanged news, strengthened friendships, and ranked several pies without an official ballot. Tomorrow, all those polished magazine ideals would return to ordinary kitchens that looked very different from one another. The magazine kitchen was not an average kitchen. It was an advertisement wearing an apron. Its counters were wide, its refrigerator was new, its cabinets matched, and no pipe ever leaked beneath the sink. A smiling white woman stood beside an electric range with enough floor space to turn gracefully while holding a finished roast. The children remained clean at a safe distance. Sunlight entered through spotless windows, and every appliance appeared to have been purchased on the same optimistic afternoon. For some American families, parts of this image were becoming real. Post-war construction, expanding suburbs, household credit, and mass-produced appliances placed modern kitchens within reach of many middle-class buyers. But outside the frame were rented apartments, crowded houses, aging farm kitchens, segregated neighborhoods, company towns, boarding houses, and families choosing between a new refrigerator and several months of necessities. The domestic ideal claimed to describe American life. In practice, it described a particular life supported by stable wages, available credit, adequate housing, nearby stores, reliable utilities, and enough time for one adult to manage the home. The woman in the advertisement was not lying exactly. She simply had excellent lighting and several economic conditions nobody had printed beneath the photograph. In a working-class kitchen, efficiency often meant making a small room perform several jobs at once. The table served breakfast, homework, sewing, bill paying, and food preparation, because there was no separate counter waiting politely nearby. A narrow stove stood close to the sink, which could be convenient until 2 people attempted to move at the same time. Cabinets held dishes, canned goods, cleaning products, and repaired objects that might become useful again. The refrigerator could be second-hand, undersized, or older than the children, with a door seal that required a firm push, and a freezer compartment gradually surrendering to frost. If the family rented improvements depended on a landlord who might consider functioning plumbing an unnecessary luxury. Hot water could run short. Electrical outlets were few. A washing machine, dishwasher, or garbage disposal belonged to another household or to the future. Yet dinner still had to appear. Lunches still needed packing. Clothing still required washing. Working-class women were praised for stretching money, but the word stretching made the process sound gentler than it was. $1 did not become larger because a woman was clever. It merely became more heavily supervised. For women who worked outside the home, the kitchen schedule began before paid employment and resumed after it. A factory worker, clerk, waitress, nurse's aide, laundry worker, seamstress or cleaner might leave breakfast dishes drying before catching a bus, then return in the evening to prepare dinner from whatever could be cooked quickly and affordably. The popular image of the full-time homemaker often treated paid work as an exception, temporary necessity, or personal choice. For many families, a woman's earnings were essential. Her second shift at home was less often described with equal clarity. She planned meals while commuting, shopped on the way back, and entered the kitchen already tired. Convenience foods could help, but they cost money and still required assembly. Leftovers were not charming opportunities for creativity. Sometimes they were the only reason dinner appeared before bedtime. Children might peel potatoes, wash dishes, or watch younger siblings. Husbands sometimes helped, though expectations remained uneven. The kitchen rule was not that the meal must be elaborate. It was that the household still needed feeding regardless of how many hours the cook had already worked somewhere else. For many black women, the polished domestic ideal contained an especially sharp contradiction. National advertising celebrated the white suburban housewife as the manager of her own modern home, while black women were frequently employed cooking, cleaning, laundering, and caring for children in white households. A woman might spend the day keeping another family's kitchen spotless, serving meals through a back doorway, and operating appliances she could not easily afford at home. She then returned to her own family where dinner, laundry, and childcare had waited without becoming less necessary. Segregation, discriminatory employment, unequal wages, restrictive housing practices, and limited access to credit shaped which kitchens families could obtain and which stores they could reach. In some neighborhoods, families paid more for poorer housing and had fewer nearby food choices. Yet black kitchens were not defined only by deprivation. They were places of skill, migration memory, family authority, celebration, and cultural continuity. Recipes carried regional histories northward and westward. Greens, beans, breads, rice, dishes, fried foods, preserves, cakes, and Sunday meals changed with location and income while holding families together. The magazine ideal offered one version of domestic dignity. Black women had long been creating their own, under conditions the magazine preferred not to photograph. Rural kitchens also stood at an awkward distance from the modern promise. Electrification had transformed many communities, but access and appliance ownership arrived unevenly, and a wire reaching the house did not automatically place a new range refrigerator, mixer, and washing machine inside it. Some farm families continued using older wood or coal-burning stoves alongside newer equipment. Such stoves provided heat and dependable cooking, but demanded fuel, ash removal, temperature judgment, and an intimate understanding of drafts and dampers. Water might come from a pump rather than a chrome faucet. Food storage could include cellars, smokehouses, canning shelves, freezers, and pantry rooms rather than a single immaculate refrigerator. The rural kitchen handled more than daily meals. It became a seasonal processing centre for vegetables, fruit, poultry, meat, jams, pickles, and preserves. During canning season, steam clouded the windows, jars covered the table, and large kettles occupied every available burner. The family might eat food grown only yards away, but this freshness arrived through planting, tending, harvesting, cleaning, preserving, and the inconvenient refusal of crops to schedule themselves around a woman's fatigue. The rural homemaker was often portrayed as old-fashioned beside her suburban counterpart, though the comparison ignored how much technical knowledge her work required. She judged soil and weather indirectly through what entered the kitchen. She knew whether fruit was ripe enough to preserve, how long jars should process according to accepted guidance, which foods belonged in cool storage, and how to feed workers whose appetite has been strengthened by physical labor. She prepared meals around planting, harvest, livestock, school schedules, and trips to town that could not be repeated casually for one forgotten ingredient. A grocery list in the suburbs might predict a week. A rural pantry often predicted a season. The work offered pride and independence, but it could also create isolation and long days without the convenient services available in town. An appliance advertisement showing a woman pressing one button to create leisure did not explain where the electricity came from, whether the wiring could support the machine, or who would repair it 40 miles from the nearest dealer. Modernity travelled. It did not always make house calls. Immigrant families and regional communities further complicated the supposedly national kitchen. A grandmother might cook with measurements based on touch cups used for drinking, and instructions delivered in another language. A daughter encountered school lessons and magazine recipes insisting on standardized spoons, packaged ingredients and meals designed to look recognizably American. The kitchen became a place of negotiation between preservation and adaptation. Familiar bread soups, noodles, stews, rice dishes, fish spices, and holiday foods remained important, while canned soup cake, mixed gelatin breakfast cereal, and frozen vegetables entered cautiously or enthusiastically. Children sometimes wanted the foods they saw advertised or encountered at friends' homes. Parents sometimes worried that traditional meals marked the family as different. A dish could therefore carry more than flavor. It could represent belonging, embarrassment, memory, or resistance. The polished magazine kitchen suggested that modern American eating had one language. Real kitchens translated constantly. Even within comfortable middle-class homes, the ideal concealed differences in labor. Some women had paid help for cleaning childcare, laundry, or cooking. Others relied on mothers, older daughters, sisters, or neighbors. A spacious kitchen was easier to keep orderly when someone else had polished the floor or watched the children. A formal dinner was easier to enjoy when another woman washed the pans afterward. Domestic success was often credited to taste and personality, while the supporting labor remained unnamed. The woman with a new dishwasher, 2 ovens, and a chest freezer did not face the same daily obstacles as the woman cooking on a damaged range in a rented apartment, yet both were judged by the appearance of dinner and the behavior of their children. The ideal converted structural advantages into personal virtue. A large refrigerator looked like good planning. A small pantry looked like poor preparation. Freshly ironed curtains suggested energy. Worn curtains suggested neglect. The room was judged without reading the conditions that produced it. By the end of the 1950s, no single kitchen could honestly represent American domestic life. There were gleaming suburban rooms and crowded tenements, farmhouses warmed by old stoves and ranch homes filled with new appliances, kitchens where paid help worked quietly, and kitchens where women returned from paid work to begin again. There were families preserving traditions, families chasing modernity, and families combining both before dinner. Across these differences, women demonstrated adaptation, memory, technical skill, and an extraordinary ability to make limited resources appear sufficient. The magazine ideal was powerful because it offered beauty, order, and comfort. It was limited because it mistook access for effort and privilege for personality. Still, the image continued to glow from advertisements promising that one more appliance might close the gap between the kitchen you had and the kitchen you were supposed to want. Soon the freezer compartment would fill with boxes, the television would influence the dinner schedule, and convenience would arrive in a metal tray divided into neat little sections. Modern life was preparing to freeze supper solid. Convenience did not lower the standard. It raised the number of things a respectable kitchen was expected to accomplish before dinner. By the late 1950s, the refrigerator had grown larger, the freezer compartment had become more ambitious, and grocery aisles were filling with frozen vegetables, fruit concentrates, prepared pies, fish sticks, and complete dinners sealed inside divided aluminum trays. The television dinner was especially persuasive. It offered meat, potatoes, vegetables, and dessert in separate compartments as though the meal had already attended a planning meeting. You removed the cardboard sleeve, peeled back, or cut the covering according to the instructions, placed the tray in the oven, and waited while supper organized itself behind the door. No chopping, no mixing bowl, no saucepan of gravy watching for weakness. The promise was not simply food, it was time. Yet the moment dinner became faster, the household found new ways to spend the minutes supposedly returned to you. The children needed help with schoolwork, laundry needed folding, the living room needed straightening before the television program began. Convenience arrived generously, then watched every saved minute receive another assignment. The frozen dinner changed the appearance of a proper meal because it arrived already portioned and strangely complete. Each compartment contained an answer: sliced meat or fried chicken, in one mashed potatoes, in another peas, or corn in a third, and perhaps a small dessert waiting in the corner with more optimism than size. The tray could be placed directly before the person eating it, reducing serving dishes and allowing the family to eat near the television rather than gather around the dining table. This felt modern, informal, and slightly thrilling. Children liked the novelty. Adults appreciated the lack of cleanup. The food might be too hot at the edges and still cold in the center, but technological progress had never promised emotional consistency. You learned to rotate the trays, extend the heating time, or cover a dry section with foil. The meal did not require culinary skill in the traditional sense, but it still required appliance judgment. An oven dial marked at one temperature might deliver another. A frozen potato could remain stubborn, while the dessert approached a geological state. Even convenience needed supervision. Television itself began to alter the household schedule. A favorite program could determine when dinner was served, where it was eaten, and how quickly the dishes were cleared. The old ideal placed the family around a table exchanging polite conversation beneath warm light. The newer reality sometimes arranged everyone in a row facing a glowing screen, forks moving automatically, while cowboys, comedians, singers, or detectives occupied the room. This did not destroy family life. It created another kind of ritual. People laughed together, followed recurring characters, and discussed programs at school or work the next day. Yet it also complicated the homemaker's timing. Food had to be ready before the program began, or simple enough to eat during it. A meal that required carving, passing, or frequent attention became inconvenient in the new television-centered evening. Frozen dinners and portable trays suited the arrangement perfectly. The food industry had not merely invented a product. It had noticed that the furniture was beginning to face a different direction. Other appliances carried similar promises. Electric mixers reduced beating time. Blenders chopped, pureed, and produced beverages with the confidence of small aircraft engines. Automatic toasters, electric skillets, deep fryers, waffle irons, coffee makers, garbage disposals, and increasingly available dishwashers each claimed to remove difficulty from domestic work. Some genuinely did. A mixer could spare an aching arm. A disposal reduced certain kitchen scraps. A dishwasher could handle stacks of plates. A freezer allowed food to be purchased or prepared ahead. These changes mattered. The mistake was imagining that time saved from one task remained unclaimed. A mixer made cake batter faster so cake could appear more often. A freezer stored more food, so more planning, labeling, defrosting, and inventory followed. A dishwasher accepted dirty dishes provided they were scraped, arranged correctly, supplied with detergent, and removed after the cycle. The machine performed labor. It also created a new management position, and the homemaker was hired immediately. Appliance ownership became part of the kitchen's public image. A new refrigerator suggested prosperity and foresight. A wall oven or built-in range suggested modern taste. A dishwasher could become a subject of conversation when neighbors visited, particularly if the hostess demonstrated its rack's controls and impressive ability to clean plates, while everyone stood nearby watching it clean plates. Advertising connected equipment with affection, efficiency, attractiveness, and family happiness. A husband buying an appliance could be shown as thoughtful. A wife receiving it could be shown as delighted, even when the gift's primary purpose was to improve the speed of her unpaid work. Many women were genuinely pleased by new machines, especially when replacing equipment that was slow, heavy, unreliable, or physically demanding. The contradiction was not that appliances lacked value. It was that their value was often measured by how much more the woman could now produce. The modern kitchen offered liberation in carefully supervised installments. The pressure grew because mechanical convenience made older excuses less acceptable. If you owned a refrigerator, food should be fresh and varied. If you owned a freezer, there should be something available for unexpected guests. If you owned a mixer, baking should not be difficult. If frozen vegetables existed, serving vegetables regularly became easier to demand. If a television dinner could be heated quickly, there was supposedly no reason anyone should go unfed on a busy evening. Every solution quietly converted a hardship into a new baseline. The homemaker with appliances was expected to keep the kitchen cleaner, offer more variety, entertain more smoothly, and respond to emergencies with greater confidence. The machine did not reduce the definition of a successful household, it expanded it. Yesterday's impressive meal became today's minimum. The appliance saved labour in one corner while ambition entered through another. Access to this modern convenience remained uneven. A family needed reliable electricity, sufficient wiring, enough kitchen space and money for purchase, installation, repairs, detergent replacement parts, and higher utility use. Renters could not always modify kitchens. Rural households might face limited service options. Black families restricted by discriminatory housing and credit practices often had fewer opportunities to purchase new homes or appliances on favourable terms. Working-class women might acquire one machine at a time, carefully choosing which task most needed relief. Second-hand equipment circulated through relative and local shops. Some appliances lasted for decades. Others failed shortly after the warranty ended, confirming an ancient domestic law that machinery becomes most expressive after the repairman leaves. Women learned to clean filters, replace cords, protect finishes, decipher manuals, and identify unfamiliar sounds. The kitchen was modern, but it still relied on someone listening closely enough to notice when the refrigerator's hum changed. Convenience foods carried economic questions too. A frozen dinner could cost more per serving than a meal assembled from basic ingredients. Packaged vegetables saved preparation, but might be less economical than seasonal produce. Cake mix reduced measuring while still requiring eggs, frosting, and electricity. The choice depended on time, money, transportation, family size, and the value placed on labour that rarely appeared in household accounting. A woman working for wages might reasonably spend more on a product that saved half an hour. A homemaker with several children might find individual frozen meals impractical. Advertising presented convenience as a universal step forward, but each kitchen performed its own calculation. The cheapest meal was not always the easiest. The easiest was not always accepted by the family. The most modern was not always the most useful. Progress entered the home through price tags as well as power cords. By the end of the decade, the kitchen looked more efficient than ever. Chrome gleamed. Motors hummed. Frozen packages stood in neat rows. A meal could emerge from the oven in a divided tray, while the family watched television only a few feet away. Yet someone still had to shop, choose store, remember heat, serve clear clean, and decide what tomorrow would require. The appliances had changed the motions of domestic labour without removing its central responsibility. They made some tasks easier, some expectations higher, and some evenings genuinely more relaxed. The freedom was real. So was the new standard built on top of it. As the trays cool and the television fades into its final program, the kitchen settles into a mechanical hum. Only one question remains after all the rules, products, schedules, and promises. What did the perfect kitchen actually demand from the woman expected to keep it running? The dishes are dry now. The last plate has been returned to the cupboard, the silverware rests in its divided drawer, and the dish towel hangs neatly from the oven handle, as though it has spent the evening doing nothing at all. The kitchen light falls across the linoleum in a warm yellow square. The refrigerator hums. The wall clock continues its small mechanical judgment. Somewhere in the house, a radio has gone quiet, a child has finally stopped asking for water, and the day appears to have ended. On the counter sits a covered dish containing tomorrow's possibility. Beside it, the percolator has been rinsed, the grease container returned to its place, and the recipe box closed over another day of corrections, substitutions and decisions. The room looks calm because every trace of effort has been folded, wiped, washed, covered, stored or carried away. This was the final rule of the perfect kitchen by nightfall. It should reveal almost nothing about what it had required from the woman who ran it. All day the kitchen asked you to think ahead while appearing entirely present. Before breakfast you judge coffee, strength, egg timing, toast temperature, and the likelihood that someone had misplaced a shoe. After breakfast you evaluated grease leftovers, dishwater laundry schedules, grocery supplies, and whether the milk would survive until tomorrow. By afternoon you were preparing dinner while calculating the family's mood. The budgets conditioned the arrival time of the husband, the appetite of the children, and the possibility that the doorbell might ring at the least dignified moment. None of these decisions was large enough to appear impressive by itself. Together they formed an invisible operating system beneath the household. You remembered which child disliked onions but accepted onion flavor if no actual onion could be seen. You knew which pan heated unevenly, which burner ran hot, which cupboard door required lifting before closing, and which leftovers had one useful day remaining. The family experienced meals. You experienced continuity. The kitchen did not merely demand work, it demanded memory. It also demanded that care be translated into objects. Love appeared as a packed lunch, a warm plate, a cup refilled before anyone asked, or a favourite dessert prepared after a difficult week. Concern became milk in the refrigerator medicine, measured beside the sink or soup carried to a sick neighbour beneath a clean towel. Pride became polished chrome straight shelf paper jars aligned in the pantry, and a pie crust that released cleanly from the pan. These gestures could be deeply meaningful. They built family rituals, preserved recipes, and created the sensory memories people carried for the rest of their lives. Decades later, someone might remember the sound of the percolator, the smell of bacon on a winter morning, or the exact pattern of the kitchen curtains without remembering how tired the woman beside the stove had been. That does not make the warmth false. It means the warmth had a producer. Comfort was not an atmosphere that floated naturally through the house. Someone planned it, shopped for it, timed it, and stayed awake long enough to clean it afterward. The difficulty was that the kitchen's rewards and pressures were often made from the same material. Feeding a family could bring satisfaction and confinement. Routine could provide stability and monotony. Skill could create authority while also becoming an obligation no one else learned to share. A woman who cooked beautifully might receive praise, but the praise could quietly guarantee that she would continue cooking every holiday, every visit, and every difficult evening. A spotless sink offered genuine pleasure, yet it could also become proof that no one was allowed to see her fall behind. New appliances relieved physical strain, but their presence increased expectations for variety, speed, and cleanliness. Convenience was real. So was the way every saved minute found another task waiting for it. The kitchen gave women a place where knowledge mattered, where small decisions affected the family, and where tradition could be shaped. It also placed the consequences of hunger waste disorder and disappointment disproportionately in their hands. Not every woman experienced this world in the same way. Some had large kitchens, new appliances, family help, and enough money to treat domestic labor as a creative project. Others cooked in cramped apartments, aging farmhouses, segregated neighborhoods, rented rooms or homes where the refrigerator was unreliable, and the grocery budget left no room for a failed recipe. Some worked full days for wages and returned to begin dinner. Some performed domestic labor in wealthier homes before facing the same work in their own. Some loved cooking, some endured it. Some followed magazine advice carefully while others laughed at it, ignored it or adapted it until the original rule was unrecognizable. Husbands sometimes helped, children sometimes learned. Grandmothers, sisters, neighbors, churchwomen and friends formed networks of knowledge that advertising could not fully control. The ideal kitchen was never universal. It was a powerful image laid over millions of different rooms, each with its own smells, limitations, quarrels, jokes, and ways of surviving. What the perfect kitchen demanded most was not perfection itself. It demanded concealment. The meal should appear without showing the budget struggle behind it. The clean dish should arrive without the reddened hands. The fresh dress should hide the afternoon stains. The smiling hostess should not mention the burned rolls cooling in the garbage. The modern appliance should look like freedom rather than another object requiring maintenance. The family's comfort should feel natural. If effort became visible, the illusion weakened. Yet the effort was where much of the intelligence lived. It was in stretching a roast, reviving leftovers, adapting a recipe, reading a child's mood, rescuing gravy, feeding an unexpected guest, and knowing when a jar in the refrigerator had crossed from economical to dangerous. The woman standing in the kitchen was not merely obeying rules. She was interpreting, negotiating, and sometimes quietly defeating them. Her improvisations kept the polished image alive even when the image gave her little credit. By the end of the decade, some of these rules were beginning to shift. More married women entered paid employment. Frozen foods and larger appliances altered meal preparation. Television changed the location and timing of family evenings. Younger women questioned certain expectations, though many continued carrying them, because questioning a rule did not remove tomorrow's breakfast. The kitchen remained central, but the idea that one woman should perform all its labor cheerfully and invisibly would become increasingly difficult to defend. Change came gradually, unevenly, and without clearing the sink first. Many old habits survived because they were practical, affectionate, or deeply familiar. Others survived because families continued benefiting from them. Even today, echoes remain in the expectation that food should appear, gatherings should be hosted, relatives should be remembered, and someone should notice when the milk is nearly gone. The appliances have changed. The mental list is remarkably durable. Now the old kitchen begins to fade. The chrome loses its reflection. The floral curtains disappear into the dark window. The refrigerator's hum softens, the clock slows, and the covered dishes retreat into a past where tomorrow's menu has already been planned. You do not need to check the stove again. You do not need to polish the faucet, prepare the coffee, or decide whether the final slice of meat can survive one more transformation. Let the house settle around the women who kept it running, not as smiling figures in advertisements, but as skilled, complicated people who created comfort while carrying expectations heavier than any cast-iron pan. Their kitchens held warmth and limitation, pride and exhaustion, memory and repetition. Both sides belong in the story. The dishes are dry, the light is off, the percolator can wait until morning, and for once the toast will simply have to manage its own temperature.